Everyone treats the Krusty Krab like it just always existed. A burger stand, a rival next door, a formula nobody can crack. Simple as that. But one hidden security tape from Karen tells a completely different story. In this video, we break down the complete timeline of the Krusty Krab restaurant, born the same day. The Krusty Krab is the busiest restaurant in Bikini Bottom. Every day, hungry customers line up for a taste of the Krabby Patty, the burger that made Eugene Krabs one of the richest crabs in the entire ocean. Right next door, in a small, rundown building shaped like a giant metal bucket, sits the Chum Bucket, a restaurant so empty that its own owner sometimes has to beg customers to walk through the door. The owner of the Chum Bucket is a tiny green creature named Sheldon Plankton, and for as long as anyone in Bikini Bottom can remember, he has spent nearly every waking moment trying to steal the secret formula that makes the Krabby Patty so special. Fans of the show have watched this same battle play out hundreds of times. Plankton builds some wild machine or hatches some sneaky plan, and Mr. Krabs and his employees stop him before any real damage is done. It has become one of the most familiar patterns in the whole series. So familiar that most viewers just accept it as the normal state of things, without ever asking how it started. But there was a point in the story where none of this rivalry existed at all. Before the Krusty Krab had a name, before the Chum Bucket was even built, before either of these two grown men became bitter enemies fighting over a hamburger, they were just two small kids trying to survive being different in a world that did not have much patience for different. The episode that finally explains all of this is called Friend or Foe, and it remains one of the most important episodes in the entire history of the show, because it is the only time the writers ever fully opened up the story of how Mr. Krabs and Plankton became who they are today. The episode begins the way so many SpongeBob episodes begin, with chaos breaking out at the Krusty Krab. Plankton launches another attack on the restaurant, trying once again to get his hands on the formula. And once again, he fails and gets thrown out. After the dust settles, SpongeBob turns to his boss and asks a simple question. He wants to know why Mr. Krabs and Plankton hate each other so much. It seems like an innocent question, the kind of thing a curious young employee might ask after watching his boss and this strange little creature clash for what must feel like the 1000th time. But the question hits something deeper in Mr. Krabs than SpongeBob expects. Instead of brushing it off with a joke the way he usually would, Mr. Krabs sits down and begins to tell a story, one that takes the audience all the way back to the very beginning. According to Mr. Krabs, he and Plankton were not always enemies. In fact, they were not even just casual friends. Mr. Krabs explains that the two of them were born on the exact same day, not just the same year, not just the same season, but the very same day, and at the very same hospital. Two creatures who could not look more different from one another. One a solid, thick-shelled crab, and the other a single-celled organism smaller than a grain of rice, entered the world at almost the same moment, in the same building, without either of their families knowing that their sons would one day grow up to define each other's entire lives. It is worth sitting with just how strange that detail really is. Bikini Bottom is home to countless species living side by side: fish, snails, squirrels, starfish, and sea creatures of every possible shape. For two characters as different as a crab and a single-celled creature to be born on the same day in the same place feels almost like fate stepping in before either of them had any say in the matter. Neither Mr. Krabs nor Plankton chose their beginning. They were simply placed into the world at the same time, and from that point forward, their paths would end up crossing again and again, long before either of them understood what money was, what a restaurant was, or what it meant to build something you were proud of. As young children, neither of them had an easy start. Mr. Krabs did not come from wealth. In fact, the flashbacks in Friend or Foe show a version of him that is almost impossible to picture next to the money-obsessed businessman fans know from the present-day series. As a boy, Mr. Krabs grew up poor. He did not have much in the way of clothing, and one flashback even shows him wrapped in nothing but a cardboard box after an older character in town, known as Old Man Jenkins, took his rags away to use as rags for cleaning a car. It is a small detail, but it says a lot about how rough things were for him early on. This was not a boy who grew up with comfort or ease. Every day came with reminders that his family did not have the money that other families seemed to have, and in a place like Bikini Bottom, where kids can be just as cruel and status-obsessed as anywhere else, that kind of poverty made him an easy target. Plankton did not have it any easier, though his struggles came from a different direction. Rather than being teased for being poor, Plankton was teased for being smart. He was the kind of kid who noticed things other kids did not notice, who thought in ways other kids did not think, and who probably had opinions and ideas far beyond what was expected of someone his age. In most schools, in most towns, being smart in that particular way does not earn you popularity. It earns you a label. Kids decided early on that Plankton was a nerd, and once that label got attached to him, it followed him everywhere. He could not walk through the halls or sit through a class without being reminded that the other kids saw him as strange, different, and someone worth mocking rather than getting to know. Two boys with almost nothing in common on the surface, one large and poor, the other tiny and overly clever, both ended up sitting outside of the normal social circles that seemed to come so easily to everyone else. Bullying is never a good thing, but in this particular story, it ended up being the exact force that pushed these two together. According to the flashbacks Mr. Krabs describes, there was a group of kids at their school who made life difficult for both of them. These bullies did not seem to care that Plankton and Krabs had nothing in common. All that mattered was that neither of them fit in, and that made them both fair game for teasing and cruelty. Being tormented by the same group of kids day after day gave the two of them something they had never expected to share. It gave them a reason to stick together. There is something almost universal about that kind of connection. Plenty of people who grew up feeling like outsiders can remember finding one other person who understood exactly what that felt like. Someone who did not need an explanation because they were living through the same thing at the same time. That is exactly how Mr. Krabs describes his early bond with Plankton. They were not friends because they had similar hobbies or similar personalities. They were friends because being an outcast together felt a whole lot better than being an outcast alone. From the moment they realized they were both targets of the same bullies, the two of them became inseparable. Instead of trying to fit in with the kids who mocked them, Plankton and Krabs built their own little world away from everyone else. The flashbacks in Friend or Foe show that the two of them spent much of their childhood hanging around an old abandoned trailer sitting near the local dump. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of place most kids would choose if they had other options. But for two boys who felt like they did not belong anywhere else in town, that beat-up trailer became something close to sacred ground. It served as their clubhouse, a private space where the rules of the schoolyard did not apply, and where being poor or being smart did not matter because there was no one else around to judge them for it. Kids everywhere have their own version of this kind of hideout. A treehouse, an old shed, a corner of a backyard nobody else uses. Somewhere that feels like it belongs only to you and the people you trust. For Plankton and Krabs, that trailer at the dump gave them a place to be exactly who they were, without worrying about what anyone at school thought. It is easy to imagine the two of them spending long afternoons there, away from the bullies, away from the judgment, just being kids together in the one spot in town where nobody bothered them. What makes this part of the story even more meaningful, especially for anyone who has watched the show for years, is how strange it feels to picture these two getting along at all, let alone being inseparable. By the time the series properly begins, Mr. Krabs and Plankton are locked into a rivalry so intense that entire episodes revolve around their fighting. Plankton is constantly scheming to steal from Mr. Krabs, and Mr. Krabs treats Plankton with nothing but suspicion and irritation. Watching Friend or Foe means watching that same tension completely dissolve and rewind back to a time when the two of them needed each other. There was no formula to fight over yet. There was no fast food empire on the line. There was just two lonely kids who found comfort in each other because the rest of the world had made it clear that neither of them belonged. It also helps explain something about both of their personalities that carries all the way into adulthood. Mr. Krabs grew up poor, and that early experience with having nothing seems to explain a lot about why he becomes so obsessed with money later in life. A kid who spent his childhood without decent clothes, who had to make do with whatever scraps were available, is exactly the kind of kid who might grow into an adult who refuses to ever feel that poor again. Meanwhile, Plankton, who was mocked for his intelligence rather than praised for it, grew into an adult who never stopped trying to prove that his cleverness deserved respect. Even as a grown man running a restaurant that barely stays open, Plankton constantly acts like someone determined to show the world that being smart should have counted for something a long time ago. Both of their adult personalities trace directly back to what happened to them as children, long before either of them had ever thought about running a business. None of this backstory takes away from the fact that their childhood friendship was, by all appearances, a real and genuine bond. This was not a relationship built out of convenience or forced together by adults. Two kids who had every reason to avoid each other, given how different they looked and how different their struggles were on paper, found something in common that mattered more than any of those surface-level differences. They were both mocked, they were both left out, and instead of letting that isolation turn them bitter toward each other, it turned them into each other's closest ally. It is also worth remembering how this whole story gets told in the first place. Friend or foe is framed as Mr. Krabs looking back and explaining his own version of events to SpongeBob. That detail matters because it means everything the audience learns about this friendship comes filtered through Mr. Krabs' own memory of what happened. Memories, even honest ones, tend to carry a certain shape to them, especially when someone is looking back at a painful ending to something that once meant a great deal. The fact that Mr. Krabs chooses to begin his story this far back, all the way at birth, rather than jumping straight to whatever eventually tore the friendship apart, says something about how much this early bond mattered to him. He does not rush through the part where he and Plankton were close. He lingers there, describing the bullying, the trailer, and the sense of togetherness they built for themselves outside of it. By the time this section of the story wraps up, two things are clear. First, Mr. Krabs and Plankton did not start out as enemies at all. They started out as two children who needed each other more than either of them probably realized at the time. Second, this friendship, as strong as it was, existed before either of them had any real responsibilities, any real stakes, or anything worth fighting over. That trailer at the dump was just a hideout for two kids escaping bullies. It had not yet become anything more than that, but that is about to change. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As Plankton and Krabs grew older, their trailer clubhouse and their bond of friendship were about to be tested in a completely different way, one that had nothing to do with schoolyard bullies and everything to do with money, pride, and a mistake that neither of them could take back. Section 2. Stinky Burgers and the Fight That Split Them Apart. Growing up together in Bikini Bottom gave Mr. Krabs and Plankton something most people search for their entire lives. It gave them someone who understood exactly what they were going through without needing an explanation. That kind of bond usually grows even stronger once two friends reach their teenage years, when responsibilities start piling up and the world starts expecting more from them. For Plankton and Krabs, that next chapter of their friendship began at a small burger stand in town called Stinky Burgers, and it is exactly where their story takes a turn that would end up shaping the rest of both of their lives. Stinky Burgers was owned and run by a grumpy old man named Old Man Jenkins, the same man who years earlier had taken young Krabs' rag clothes away just to clean his car. Jenkins was not exactly known for being kind or generous. He ran his burger stand the way plenty of small business owners run their shops, with an eye on every penny and very little patience for mistakes. Working for him would not have been easy for anyone, let alone two teenagers who had already spent years being pushed to the side by the rest of the town. Still, a job was a job, and for two friends who grew up with almost nothing, getting hired at Stinky Burgers gave them a chance to finally earn some money of their own. The work itself was simple. Customers would come up to the counter, place their order, and the two friends would head to the back to cook up whatever was needed. It was not glamorous work. Flipping burgers at a rundown stand owned by a cranky old man is not exactly the kind of job that gets celebrated in the moment. But there was something valuable happening underneath the surface. For the first time, Plankton and Krabs were not just hiding away from bullies in an old trailer. They were building something together, learning how to work as a team, and figuring out how to run a kitchen side by side. Neither of them could have known it at the time, but those long shifts at Stinky Burgers were quietly teaching them the exact skills they would need for what came next. At some point during their time working there, the two friends decided to experiment. Rather than just cooking the same burgers Jenkins had always served, they started trying to come up with something better, something entirely their own. This was not part of their job. Nobody at Stinky Burgers asked them to invent a brand new recipe. It was something they did on their own time, likely fueled by the same creative spark that had made them close friends in the first place. Krabs brought his own ideas to the table, and Plankton brought his. Between the two of them, they slowly worked toward a burger unlike anything Bikini Bottom had ever tasted. Getting there was not smooth. According to the flashbacks Mr. Krabs shares, the two of them went through plenty of failed attempts before landing on something worth serving to another living creature. Cooking is often like that. Anyone who has ever tried to make a recipe from scratch knows that the first few tries rarely turn out the way you hoped. Ingredients get mixed in the wrong amounts, flavors clash instead of blend, and sometimes the whole thing just just falls apart before it even gets close to being edible. Plankton and crabs went through this same process, trying combination after combination, learning from each failure, and slowly inching closer to whatever it was they were chasing. Eventually, they decided it was time to test their creation on somebody outside of just the two of them. They needed an honest opinion, someone willing to actually eat what they made and tell them the truth about it. The person they picked for this important taste test was none other than Old Man Jenkins, their own boss. It might seem like a strange choice, handing your very first homemade burger over to the one man in town least likely to hand out compliments for free. But maybe that was exactly the point. If a burger could impress someone as tough and stingy as Jenkins, it would prove that the recipe was truly something special. The test did not go the way either of them expected. Instead of taking a bite and offering feedback, good or bad, Old Man Jenkins was knocked completely unconscious the moment the burger hit his mouth. Whatever was in that early version of the recipe hit him with a force strong enough to send him falling over right there on the spot. For two young friends hoping to hear a simple opinion, watching their boss drop to the floor after eating their creation must have been a shocking and confusing moment. It was clearly not the reaction they had hoped for, and it left both of them scrambling to figure out what had just happened and who was responsible for it. This is where the story takes its first sharp turn, away from friendship and toward conflict. Rather than working together to figure out what went wrong, Plankton and Crabs turned on each other. An argument broke out between the two of them right there at the burger stand, each one blaming the other for whatever ingredient or mistake had caused Jenkins to pass out. It is worth remembering that up until this point, these two had spent their entire childhood as a team, standing together against bullies, sharing a hideout, working side by side at the same job. This argument marks the very first real crack in that bond, the first moment where instead of facing a problem together, they turned it into a fight about whose fault it was. According to Mr. Krabs' version of events, told to SpongeBob during the flashback sequence in Friend or Foe, the argument grew heated enough that it ended with Plankton being knocked into a nearby pile of trash. Mr. Krabs tells this version of the story as though he were simply defending himself, framing Plankton as the one who lost his temper and ended up worse for it. But almost immediately after telling his version, Plankton steps in with a very different account of the same event. According to Plankton, the roles were completely reversed. In his telling, it was Krabs who wanted to take control of the situation, and Krabs who ended up thrown into the trash pile after the argument turned physical. Two grown men standing in the same room, giving two opposite versions of the exact same fight from decades earlier. Anyone watching this unfold would naturally start to wonder who is actually telling the truth. Memory has a funny way of shifting over time, especially when it comes to moments where pride and embarrassment are involved. Neither Mr. Krabs nor Plankton wants to admit they were the one who ended up in the trash. Neither one wants to be remembered as the loser of that argument. So each of them, without meaning to lie exactly, shapes the story in a way that makes them look a little better and the other look a little worse. Luckily for the audience, and for SpongeBob sitting right there listening to both conflicting stories, there happened to be a witness who was recording the entire thing the whole time. Karen, Plankton's computer wife, finally steps into the argument between Mr. Krabs and Plankton and reveals that she has the real footage of what actually happened that day. Karen explains that she was functioning as a security camera at the time, meaning she captured the entire fight without either of them realizing they were being recorded. Her footage puts an end to the argument once and for all, showing the audience exactly what took place, free from either man's biased retelling. According to Karen's recording, the truth of what happened at Stinky Burgers is actually simpler than either version Mr. Krabs or Plankton had been telling. The burger stand had almost no customers that day. In fact, the only person who showed any interest in trying their new burger creation was Old Man Jenkins himself, since nobody else happened to be around. After Jenkins was knocked out from the first bite, an argument broke out between Plankton and Krabs over the formula and who deserved credit for it. During that argument, in a moment of frustration, Plankton stormed off and slammed the door on his way out. That slammed door turned out to be the most important moment in the entire story. The force of Plankton slamming it caused a shelf nearby to shake loose, and a handful of random ingredients tumbled off of it, falling directly into the patty mixture that the two of them had been working on. What should have been a disaster, an accident caused entirely by anger rather than skill, ended up creating something incredible. Whatever combination of ingredients fell from that shelf and mixed into the batter that day turned the recipe into something completely different from what either of them had originally cooked up. Without meaning to, and without either of them planning it, Plankton's angry exit accidentally finished the recipe that would soon change change both of their lives forever. There is something almost impossible to believe about how this all played out. The Krabby Patty, the single most popular food item in all of Bikini Bottom, the burger that built an entire restaurant empire and turned Mr. Krabs into one of the richest crabs in the ocean, was not the result of careful planning or brilliant cooking skill. It was the result of an argument, a slammed door, and a shelf that happened to shake loose at exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right, moment. Neither Krabs nor Plankton set out to invent anything close to what the formula eventually became. It happened almost entirely by accident, born out of anger rather than teamwork. Once the ingredients had fallen and mixed together, someone needed to actually try the result to know whether it was any good. This time, the outcome was completely different from the first attempt. Rather than knocking someone unconscious, this new version of the burger turned out to be delicious beyond anything either of them had cooked before. Word about this incredible new burger spread quickly around town, and before long, people who had never shown any interest in stinky burgers were lining up just for a taste of whatever new creation Krabs and Plankton had stumbled into. This is the exact point where their friendship, already cracked from the earlier argument, finally shattered for good. Suddenly, there was something worth fighting over, and that something was not just pride anymore. It was money, fame, and the kind of attention that neither of them had ever experienced growing up as outcasts. Krabs, who had spent his childhood poor and looked down on, was suddenly being praised by the very same people who once treated him with disrespect. Being adored for something he helped create must have felt like everything he had been missing his whole life. Meanwhile, Plankton, who had spent his childhood mocked for being different, wanted just as badly to be seen as the true genius behind the recipe, rather than someone whose contribution came from an accidental slammed door. Neither one was willing to share the spotlight. Since the two of them could not agree on how to handle their sudden success together, the partnership that had carried them through childhood and their early working years finally came apart completely. The recipe itself became a literal symbol of that breakup, since, according to the story, the formula they had written down ended up torn in half during the chaos of everything falling apart. Each of them walked away holding one half of the same piece of paper, neither willing to hand their half over to the other. Plankton's half of that torn paper reportedly held only a small, almost useless detail from the recipe, something along the lines of a small amount of a certain ingredient, rather than anything close to the full formula. Mr. Krabs, on the other hand, ended up holding on to the larger, far more complete half of the recipe, giving him the real advantage once the two of them decided to go their separate ways. This uneven split explains so much about the decades of conflict that follow. Plankton was never simply trying to steal a stranger's secret recipe out of pure greed. In his mind, he was trying to reclaim something that was partly his own creation in the first place, something that got torn away from him unfairly the same day their friendship ended. From that point forward, the two of them stopped being partners and became rivals. Krabs took his larger portion of the recipe and eventually built it into what would become the Krusty Krab, a restaurant that would grow to become the single most successful business in all of Bikini Bottom. Plankton, holding on to his smaller and less complete piece of the puzzle, opened his own restaurant just down the street, calling it the Chum Bucket. Where one restaurant thrived beyond anything either of them could have imagined as kids, the other struggled from nearly the very beginning, unable to match the flavor or popularity of whatever Krabs had managed to put together with his half of the formula. It would be easy to look at this story and simply label Plankton as the villain and Krabs as the innocent victim, especially since that is how most of the series treats their ongoing rivalry today. But looking closely at how everything actually unfolded complicates that simple picture. This was not a case of one friend stealing credit from another out of nowhere. It started with a shared invention, built together through real effort and teamwork, that fell apart because pride and fear of losing control got in the way of two young friends being able to share success. Both of them wanted the recognition. Both of them wanted to be seen as the one who mattered most. And because neither one was willing to give an inch, they ended up splitting apart the one thing that had ever truly belonged to both of them equally. By the end of this chapter in their story, Mr. Krabs and Plankton were no longer the two boys hiding out together in an old trailer near the dump. They were now grown adults, each running a business built out of the wreckage of a friendship that could not survive success. One recipe, one accidental burger, had turned two childhood best friends into business rivals, locked into a fight that would stretch on for the rest of their lives. lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What neither of them realized at the time was just how far that small, torn piece of paper would carry them. The restaurant Krabs built out of his half of the formula was still nothing more than a tiny, humble beginning, far from the busy, fast food landmark it would eventually become. Getting from that first successful batch of burgers to a full working restaurant with employees, a kitchen, and the name known across all of Bikini Bottom would take time, effort, and a whole lot of unexpected turns still waiting just ahead. Section 3. From a trailer to a restaurant. After Mr. Krabs and Plankton split apart, each one walked away with a piece of paper and a plan. Mr. Krabs had the bigger half of the recipe, and Plankton had the smaller half. Somewhere in the middle of all that anger and heartbreak, one small detail carried over from their childhood friendship into this brand new chapter of their lives. The old trailer near the dump, the same place where two lonely kids once hid away from bullies, ended up getting a second purpose. According to the story passed down through the show, that same beat-up trailer became the starting point for the restaurant that Krabs and Plankton had once planned to build together. Since it was the only thing either of them could actually afford at the time, it made sense to put it to use rather than start from nothing. It says a lot that the very first version of what would eventually become the biggest restaurant in Bikini Bottom was not a restaurant at all in the way most people picture one today. There were no booths, no cash register, no big glowing sign out front. It was a trailer, likely the same rusted, dented, hand-me-down shelter that had already lived one full life as a childhood clubhouse. Turning that trailer into a place that could actually sell food to paying customers would have taken real work, real imagination, and a fair amount of stubbornness from two young men who had already lost so much just to get to this point. Building a business out of practically nothing is never an easy road, and there is nothing in the story to suggest that Krabs and Plankton had any kind of head start. They were not born into money, they did not inherit a building or a loan from a wealthy relative. What they had was a torn recipe, an old trailer, and whatever determination was left over after watching their friendship collapse. That combination, as unlikely as it sounds, became the seed of what would grow into one of the most famous restaurants in the entire ocean. At this point in the story, it becomes important to slow down and look honestly at something that fans of the show have pointed out for years. The version of events told through Friend or Foe, where Krabs grew up poor and built the Krusty Krab up slowly from almost nothing alongside Plankton, does not perfectly match up with a few other episodes that came both before and after it. In an episode called Dunces and Dragons, the story takes a medieval fantasy turn and suggests that the Krabby Patty recipe actually goes back generations in the Krabs family line, tracing all the way back to an ancestor referred to as King Krabs. That version paints an entirely different picture, one where the formula was something inherited rather than something invented by accident at a burger stand, with Plankton standing right beside him. Another episode, known as the Krusty Krab training video, adds yet another layer to the confusion. In that version of events, young Mr. Krabs is shown already fully aware of money and its value from a very early age. Nothing like the poor, ragged childhood described in Friend or Foe. That episode suggests Mr. Krabs eventually bought an old, failed retirement home and converted it into what became the Krusty Krab, rather than building the whole thing up gradually out of a trailer with his childhood best friend. On top of that, the training video shows a young Mr. Krabs already selling food out of a small cart that looks strikingly similar to the restaurant he would go on to build later, years before his supposed accidental invention of the formula alongside Plankton. None of these versions can all be true at the same time, at least not without some serious bending of the timeline. A show that has run for well over 2 decades, with dozens of different writers contributing scripts across hundreds of episodes, is bound to end up with a few stories that do not perfectly line up with each other. Rather than pretending this contradiction does not exist, it is worth being upfront about it. Friend or Foe remains the most detailed, most emotionally developed version of how the Krusty Krab came to be, and it is the version most fans, and even the show itself, tend to treat as the true origin story. But it does not erase the fact that other episodes, made at different points during the show's long history, tell pieces of this same story in ways that do not fully match. Setting the fantasy version and the training video version aside for a moment, the trailer story from Friend or Foe gives the clearest and most complete picture of how the actual restaurant slowly came together. Once Krabs and Plankton, no longer friends but now business rivals, each had their own version of the recipe. They needed somewhere to actually cook and sell it. That leftover trailer, already sitting there from their years of friendship, became the most obvious and cheapest option. Rather than needing to build something from scratch, they simply repurposed what they already had sitting around, turning a childhood hideout into the first version of a food business. It is worth pointing out just how humble this beginning really was. This was not some grand opening with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a crowd of excited customers waiting outside. This was two young men, freshly broken apart from each other, trying to figure out how to turn a burnt-out clubhouse into something that could actually make money. Whatever early version of the Krusty Krab existed at this stage likely looked nothing like the restaurant fans recognize from the show today. There would not have been a giant anchor-shaped sign, no indoor dining room filled with booths, none of the features that make the modern Krusty Krab instantly recognizable. It would have been small, rough around the edges, and built entirely out of necessity rather than luxury. Slowly, over what was likely a long stretch of time, that small trailer operation grew into something bigger. Building any successful restaurant takes years of steady work, word of mouth, repeat customers, and a whole lot of trial and error. The Krabby Patty recipe itself, born out of that accidental mix of ingredients falling off a shelf, gave crabs a huge advantage right from the start. Once people in Bikini Bottom got a taste of that first burger, the one that came together after Plankton's frustrated door slam, word about it likely spread fast. Good food has a way of pulling in customers, no matter how humble the location selling it might be. Mr. Krabs, even from a young age, seemed to understand something important about running a business that Plankton either did not grasp or did not care to focus on in the same way. Where Plankton's mind constantly drifted toward big, complicated schemes and grand plans for world domination, Mr. Krabs appeared to stay locked in on the basics. Serve good food, keep customers happy, bring in money. That simple, steady focus likely played a huge role in why one restaurant thrived while the other, built off a smaller and less complete version of the same recipe, struggled from nearly the beginning. As the restaurant grew, it eventually needed an actual name, something that could hang above the door and stick in people's minds. The name Krusty Krab fits Mr. Krabs perfectly, combining his own species with a word that sounds crisp, appetizing, and easy to remember all at once. Naming a business after yourself, in one way or another, is a common move for small business owners everywhere, and Mr. Krabs choosing a name so closely tied to his own identity says something about how personally invested he was in this restaurant from the very start. This was not just a job for him, it was becoming something closer to his entire identity. Around this same time, according to the timeline suggested by the show, Plankton was building his own restaurant just down the road, using his smaller portion of the torn recipe as his foundation. He named his restaurant the Chum Bucket, a name that, compared to the Krusty Krab, sounds far less appealing right from the start. Chum is typically used as fish bait, not as something anyone would want to willingly eat for dinner. Whether Plankton chose that name on purpose, or simply because it matched the ingredients he had access to, the name itself set an early tone for how differently these two restaurants would be viewed by the people of Bikini Bottom. From nearly the beginning, the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket were never on equal footing. One had a stronger, more complete version of a recipe that people genuinely loved. The other had a smaller fragment of that same recipe, missing whatever key detail had made the original burger so special. This imbalance, built into the very foundation of both restaurants, explains so much about why the rivalry between Krabs and Plankton would end up being so lopsided for decades to come. Plankton was never simply trying to steal a stranger's success. He was trying to recover something that had once belonged to both of them equally, chasing after the missing piece that could finally make his own restaurant succeed the way Krabs' restaurant already had. As the years went by, the Krusty Krab slowly transformed from that humble trailer into the full-sized restaurant fans recognize today. This kind of growth rarely happens overnight. It usually takes years of steady customers, careful reinvestment of profits, and a whole lot of patience. Mr. Krabs, given his lifelong obsession with money, was likely exactly the kind of business owner who would pour every extra coin back into improving his restaurant rather than spending it carelessly. Bit by bit, that trailer would have been replaced or built upon, eventually becoming the anchor-shaped building that customers walk into throughout the show. The location of the Krusty Krab itself also plays a role in understanding how the restaurant grew. Sitting right in the heart of Bikini Bottom, close enough to the Chum Bucket that the two restaurants remain neighbors throughout the entire series, the Krusty Krab's spot in town would have made it an easy stop for hungry residents. Restaurants that manage to plant themselves in the right location, somewhere central and easy to reach, often have a much easier time building a steady stream of regular customers. Whether this was intentional planning planning on Mr. Krab's part, or simply where the old trailer happened to already be sitting, the location worked heavily in his favor over time. It is also worth remembering that none of this growth happened because Mr. Krabs was simply lucky. Running any restaurant, especially one that eventually grows into the most successful business in an entire town, takes constant effort. Food needs to be cooked fresh every single day. Customers need to be kept happy. Problems, whether it is spoiled ingredients, unhappy workers, or unexpected disasters, need to be solved as they come up. Mr. Krabs may be remembered by fans mostly for his greed and his tight grip on every penny, but underneath that reputation is a business owner who managed to keep a restaurant thriving for years and years, something that takes real work, no matter how much natural advantage that torn recipe gave him at the start. Meanwhile, just down the street, Plankton's Chum Bucket was going through the opposite experience. Instead of growing into a beloved local business, it remained mostly empty year after year, decade after decade. This stark difference between the two restaurants, one thriving beyond anything either of them could have imagined as kids, and the other barely scraping by, likely deepened the wound left over from their broken friendship. Every single day that the Krusty Krab stayed packed with customers, while the Chum Bucket sat quiet and empty next door, would have served as a constant, painful reminder to Plankton of exactly what he had lost the day their partnership fell apart. This imbalance between the two restaurants is not just background information. It is the entire foundation for the decades of conflict that fans have watched unfold across hundreds of episodes. Every scheme Plankton comes up with, every wild machine he builds, every sneaky plan he hatches to steal the Krabby Patty formula traces directly back to this early gap between the two businesses. He is not simply a cartoon villain scheming for no reason. He is a man who watched his childhood best friend build an empire out of the same recipe that left him with almost nothing. And that gap between success and failure has fueled his obsession for what the show suggests has been decades of his life. By the time the Krusty Krab reached the size and success shown throughout most of the series, it had already gone through years of quiet, steady growth that gets skipped over in most episodes. Viewers rarely get to see this middle stretch of the story, the years between the trailer and the full-sized restaurant, the slow accumulation of customers and reputation that turned a humble food stand into a local landmark. Most of what audiences know about this stretch comes from small hints and background details scattered across different episodes, rather than one clean, complete story. What does become clear, piecing together everything the show has revealed, is that the Krusty Krab did not become successful overnight, and it did not become successful by accident either, aside from that one lucky moment when the formula itself came together through a slammed door and a shaking shelf. Everything that came after that moment, the growth from trailer to restaurant, the steady stream of customers, the reputation that eventually made the Krabby Patty the most famous food item in all of Bikini Bottom, came from years of consistent work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The restaurant Mr. Krabs built could not stay a one-man operation forever. As customers kept coming, he needed real help behind the counter and in the kitchen. That next hire would shape the Krusty Krab into the workplace fans know today, long before a certain yellow sponge ever thought about applying for a job there. Section 4. Jim and the hiring of Squidward. By the time the Krusty Krab had grown from a beat-up trailer into a real working restaurant, Mr. Krabs had a problem that plenty of small business owners eventually run into. He had built something popular enough that he could no longer run it alone. Cooking, serving, cleaning, and handling money all at the same time might work when a restaurant is brand new and quiet, but once customers start showing up in real numbers, one person simply cannot keep up with everything by himself. Mr. Krabs needed help, and at some point before the events fans see at the start of the series, he brought on 2 new employees who would end up shaping the daily rhythm of the restaurant for years to come. The first of these 2 employees was a fry cook named Jim. Jim does not get much attention in the show today, and most casual viewers have probably never even heard his name. He only appears briefly, shown working behind the grill in an episode called The Original Fry Cook, which gives fans one of the only real glimpses into what the Krusty Krab looked like before SpongeBob ever set foot inside it. In that episode, Jim is shown as the fry cook responsible for cooking the food, standing at the same grill that SpongeBob would eventually take over completely. Alongside him at the restaurant during this same period was a very different looking version of Squidward tentacles than the one fans know today. The Squidward shown working alongside Jim looked looks nothing like the bald, grumpy cashier audiences have grown used to seeing in nearly every episode of the show. In this earlier version, Squidward is shown with long, flowing hair, a detail that surprises plenty of longtime fans the first time they see it. It is easy to forget, watching modern episodes, that Squidward was not always bald. That detail alone tells viewers just how far back this particular period of the Krusty Krab's history goes, long before the version of the restaurant most people picture when they think about the show. According to the story shown in the original Fry Cook, Squidward and Jim worked together at the Krusty Krab during this earlier stretch of time, with Jim manning the grill and Squidward working somewhere nearby, likely already handling some version of the cashier duties he would go on to be known for later. It was during the same period, on the very same day that Jim ends up quitting his job at the restaurant, that Squidward goes through the strange and sudden change that leaves him bald for the rest of the series. The exact details of how this happened are treated more like a running joke throughout the show than a fully explained event, but the show makes clear that losing his long hair and losing his coworker Jim happened at almost the exact same moment. Jim quitting his job left an opening at the Krusty Krab, one that would eventually need to be filled by someone else entirely. Fans who have watched the show for years know that this open fry cook position would not stay empty forever, but at this point in the timeline, that empty spot behind the grill was still waiting to be filled. For a while, at least according to what little information the show provides, the Krusty Krab operated without a dedicated fry cook, or possibly with Squidward reluctantly filling in wherever needed until someone new came along. Squidward himself deserves a closer look at this point in the story, since understanding who he was even before SpongeBob arrived helps explain so much about how he behaves throughout the rest of the series. Squidward Tentacles is an octopus, despite carrying a name that suggests he might be some kind of squid. He lives in a house shaped like a giant stone head, sitting directly between the homes of two characters who will eventually become the most important and most exhausting presences in his daily life. Squidward is intelligent, well-educated, and carries himself with a certain amount of pride about his own taste and culture. He sees himself as someone destined for finer things, someone who deserves a life filled with art, music, and quiet sophistication, rather than the noisy chaos of working a fast food counter. That gap between how Squidward sees himself and the actual job he holds down every single day creates a huge amount of tension that runs through nearly every episode of the show. Squidward does not love working at the Krusty Krab. In fact, most episodes make it clear that he finds the job boring, beneath him, and generally unpleasant. Despite this, he keeps showing up, shift after shift, year after year, never actually leaving to pursue whatever finer, more artistic life he imagines for himself. Part of this comes down to simple practicality. Jobs are not always easy to come by, and walking away from steady income to chase an uncertain dream takes a kind of risk that Squidward, deep down, never seems willing to take. Squidward's personality plays a huge role in shaping the atmosphere of the Krusty Krab throughout the show's history, where Mr. Krabs is loud, greedy, and constantly focused on making money, and where SpongeBob, once he arrives, brings an almost endless supply of energy and enthusiasm to even the most boring tasks. Squidward sits somewhere in between, as the tired, unimpressed voice of someone who has simply seen too much. He handles the register with a kind of practiced misery, dealing with customers who often annoy him and coworkers who exhaust him even more. Long before SpongeBob ever showed up to make his daily life more complicated, Squidward was already a somewhat unhappy employee, someone who clocked in because he had to, not because he wanted to. Working at the Krusty Krab during this earlier period, before the restaurant reached its later fame and size, would have looked very different from the busy, high-energy workplace fans see once the series properly begins. With Jim gone and no clear replacement yet in place, the restaurant likely ran a little rougher around the edges during this stretch, relying on whoever happened to be available to help keep the kitchen and counter running. Mr. Krabs, always focused on keeping costs low and profits high, would not have wanted to leave that fry cook position empty for long, since an empty station behind the grill means slower service and unhappy customers. It is worth pointing out just how much responsibility Squidward carried during this early period, at least based on what little the show reveals. Being the one steady presence at the restaurant, especially after losing a coworker, likely meant taking on extra duties beyond just running the register. Whether that meant occasionally stepping behind the grill himself, or simply managing the flow of customers on his own for a while, Squidward would have needed to adjust to running things without the same kind of support he once had. None of this is shown in great detail, since the show tends tends to treat this earlier period of the Krusty Krab's history as background information rather than a fully explored storyline. Still, piecing together the clues from episodes like The Original Fry Cook gives fans a decent picture of what things must have looked like during this gap between one fry cook leaving and another eventually arriving. Understanding Squidward's position during this stretch also helps explain a lot about how he reacts once SpongeBob finally does show up looking for a job. By that point, Squidward had already been working at the Krusty Krab for a long stretch of time, likely feeling settled, if not exactly thrilled, with the routine he had built for himself. Adding a brand new employee into that mix, especially one as loud, eager, and endlessly enthusiastic as SpongeBob would turn out to be, threatened to disrupt whatever quiet, low-energy rhythm Squidward had managed to establish for himself over the years. It makes sense, looking back, why Squidward would end up so resistant to the idea of hiring someone new, especially someone whose personality sits about as far from his own as possible. There is also something worth noting about how Mr. Krabs ran his restaurant during this period, based on the pattern that continues throughout the rest of the show. Mr. Krabs has never been the type of boss who pays generously or treats his employees with much warmth. His focus, from the very beginning of the Krusty Krab's history, always seems to circle back to money above almost everything else. Employees at the Krusty Krab work hard, often under difficult conditions, for pay that never seems to match the effort they put in. This pattern likely started long before SpongeBob ever arrived, meaning Squidward would have already been dealing with a boss more interested in profit than in employee well-being for a good stretch of time before the series even begins. Despite all of this, the restaurant kept growing. Whatever gap was left behind after Jim's departure did not stop the Krusty Krab from continuing to build its reputation as the best place in Bikini Bottom to grab a good meal. Customers kept coming, drawn in by the same incredible formula that Krabs and Plankton had accidentally created years earlier during their time at Stinky Burgers. Squidward, whether he enjoyed it or not, remained the steady face behind the counter during this stretch, helping keep the business running even as the restaurant around him continued expanding into the local landmark fans would eventually recognize. It is easy, looking back at the entire series, to forget just how long Squidward has actually been working at the Krusty Krab compared to SpongeBob. Fans often think of SpongeBob as the heart and soul of the restaurant, the one employee whose energy and dedication keep the whole place running. But long before SpongeBob ever picked up a spatula, Squidward was already there, already working the same register, already dealing with the same demanding boss. This makes Squidward, in a very real sense, one of the most senior employees the Krusty Krab has ever had, someone who has watched the restaurant grow and change over a period of time far longer than most viewers probably realize. This detail adds an interesting layer to how fans might view Squidward's constant frustration throughout the show. Someone who has spent years working a job they never wanted, watching new employees come and go, dealing with the same repetitive tasks day after day, is bound to build up a certain amount of resentment over time. Squidward's grumpy attitude, rather than being just a simple character trait added for comedic effect, starts to look a lot more understandable once viewers consider just how long he has actually been stuck in that same position, doing the same tedious work, long before the show's main story even begins. None of this means Squidward was ever truly trapped or unable to leave. Plenty of episodes throughout the series show him briefly attempting to escape his job or his neighborhood, only to end up coming back each time. This pattern likely started forming even during this early stretch of his employment, long before SpongeBob arrived to add even more chaos into his daily routine. Squidward's relationship with the Krusty Krab has always been complicated, filled with more frustration than satisfaction, yet somehow strong enough to keep him coming back shift after shift for years on end. By the time the restaurant reached the point where it desperately needed to fill that empty fry cook position left behind after Jim's departure, the Krusty Krab had already firmly established itself as the most successful restaurant in all of Bikini Bottom. Squidward had settled, however reluctantly, into his role as the restaurant's cashier. Mr. Krabs continued running things with his usual sharp focus on profit, and somewhere out there, unaware of any of this history, a certain young sea sponge was about to wake up one morning with big dreams of finally landing a job at the one restaurant everyone in town seemed to love. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That morning, and the chaos that came with it, would change the Krusty Krab forever, bringing in an employee whose energy and dedication would end up defining defining the restaurant for the rest of its history. Section 5. The Hydrodynamic Spatula. Every long-running story eventually reaches a moment that changes everything that comes after it. And for the Krusty Krab, that moment arrived on an ordinary morning when a small yellow sponge woke up in his pineapple home with one single goal in mind. That sponge was SpongeBob SquarePants, and the day he decided to apply for a job at the Krusty Krab would end up becoming one of the most important days in the entire history of the restaurant, even though nobody working there that morning had any idea what was about to happen. The episode that tells this story is called Help Wanted, and it holds a special place in the show's history for a very simple reason. It is the very first episode ever made. Before any of the hundreds of episodes that would follow, before any of the movies, before any of the countless schemes Plankton would cook up over the years, there was this one episode introducing audiences to Bikini Bottom, to SpongeBob, and to the restaurant that would end up becoming the center of his entire life. The episode begins with SpongeBob waking up to his foghorn alarm clock, a detail that already tells viewers something about his personality before he even leaves the house. Most people wake up to a normal alarm clock, something quiet and simple. SpongeBob wakes up to a loud foghorn blast, the kind of sound usually reserved for warning ships about danger, not for waking up a small sponge getting ready for his day. It sets the tone for exactly the kind of energy SpongeBob brings into everything he does. Loud, enthusiastic, and completely unfiltered. After waking up, SpongeBob talks to his pet snail Gary about the importance of the day ahead. He explains that he needs to be in good shape because today is the day he finally applies for a job at the Krusty Krab. This detail matters a lot because it shows that working at the Krusty Krab was not some random decision SpongeBob stumbled into by accident. It was something he had clearly been thinking about, planning for, and looking forward to well before the episode even begins. For whatever reason, out of every possible job in Bikini Bottom, the Krusty Krab was the one place SpongeBob wanted to work. As he heads out toward the restaurant, SpongeBob runs into his best friend Patrick Star, who lives nearby under a rock. Patrick, despite his usual laid-back and somewhat clueless personality, ends up being a source of encouragement for SpongeBob during this important moment. When SpongeBob briefly loses his confidence on the way to the restaurant, worried that he might not be ready or good enough for the job, Patrick cheers him on, reminding him that he was born to have a job. That small moment of support from his best friend gives SpongeBob the push he needs to keep walking toward the Krusty Krab, rather than turning back home. Meanwhile, at the restaurant itself, Squidward Tentacles is going about his usual routine, cleaning up graffiti that someone had drawn on the side of the building, a doodle of his own face along with the word loser scribbled next to it. It is a small detail, but it says a lot about how the rest of the town views Squidward, and it helps explain some of his sour attitude even before SpongeBob shows up looking for work. Squidward spots SpongeBob running toward the restaurant and immediately panics, rushing inside to warn his boss, Eugene Krabs, that trouble might be on the way. By this point in the story, Mr. Krabs has already fully settled into the version of himself that fans recognize throughout the rest of the series, a business owner obsessed with money above almost everything else. When SpongeBob finally arrives at the counter and asks about the job opening, Squidward wastes no time trying to talk Mr. Krabs out of hiring him. He clearly does not want this young, overly enthusiastic sponge working alongside him, likely sensing, correctly, that SpongeBob's energy would end up disrupting whatever routine Squidward had built for himself over the years. Krabs listens to Squidward's warning, but rather than turning SpongeBob away outright, he decides to test him instead. He tells SpongeBob that if he can bring back a hydrodynamic spatula, a tool that, as far as the restaurant is concerned, does not actually exist, then he will get the job. This request was never meant to be taken seriously. Mr. Krabs clearly expected SpongeBob to wander off looking for something impossible to find, giving him and Squidward an easy excuse to send him away without technically saying no to his face. It is a classic move, giving someone a task designed to fail rather than simply rejecting them directly. SpongeBob, taking the challenge completely seriously, heads off in search of this made-up spatula, fully believing that finding it will earn him the job he has wanted for so long. While he is away on this pointless errand, chaos breaks out at the Krusty Krab in a way nobody could have predicted. A massive group of anchovies, small fish known for traveling and eating in large schools, storm into the restaurant demanding Krabby Patties. What starts as a simple crowd of hungry customers quickly spirals into complete pandemonium, with the anchovies growing more and more aggressive as they wait for food that is not coming fast enough. Squidward tries to bring order to the chaos, asking the anchovies to form a single file line in front of the register, a reasonable request under normal circumstances. But the anchovies have no interest in following any kind of order. Instead, they turn the whole situation into a wild, chaotic riot, swarming around the restaurant like a stormy ocean wave crashing through the front doors. The scene grows so out of control that Squidward and Mr. Krabs end up forced to climb up onto some part of the restaurant's structure just to avoid being crushed underneath the flood of hungry, impatient fish. It is in the middle of this total disaster that SpongeBob finally returns, arriving at exactly the right moment with an object he calls his hydrodynamic spatula, complete with what he describes as port and starboard attachments and a turbo drive. Mr. Krabs, watching this scene unfold, is completely stunned. He never actually expected SpongeBob to find anything close to what he had asked for, since the whole request had only ever been meant as a way to get rid of him. Seeing SpongeBob show up with exactly what he asked for, at the exact moment the restaurant desperately needs help, leaves Mr. Krabs with no real choice but to take him seriously. What happens next becomes one of the most important moments in the entire history of the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob rushes into the kitchen and begins cooking, using his newly acquired spatula to whip up an enormous stream of Krabby Patties at a speed and skill level nobody at the restaurant had ever seen before. One by one, the hungry anchovies are fed, their aggressive chaos slowly settling down as their stomachs finally get filled with exactly what they came for. By the time the very last anchovy receives its Krabby Patty, the restaurant has gone from a scene of total disaster back to a normal, functioning business. All thanks to this one sponge nobody had taken seriously just minutes earlier. Mr. Krabs, watching this entire transformation happen right in front of him, is absolutely delighted. Not only did SpongeBob manage to calm down an out-of-control mob of anchovies, he did it while showing off a level of cooking talent that Mr. Krabs had likely never seen from any previous employee, including Squidward. True to his word, and probably even more convinced now than he would have been otherwise, Mr. Krabs officially hires SpongeBob on the spot. He welcomes him into what he calls the Krusty Crew, hands him a name tag, and even leads a small cheer in his honor, celebrating the newest member of his restaurant's staff. This moment marks the true beginning of everything fans have come to associate with the Krusty Krab throughout the rest of the series. Before this day, the restaurant had already grown from a small trailer into a proper business, already gone through the departure of one fry cook and the long, steady presence of an unhappy cashier. But it was this moment, this single test involving a made-up tool and an unexpected flood of hungry anchovies, that finally brought SpongeBob into the picture, setting the stage for the version of the Krusty Krab that would go on to define the entire show. Squidward's reaction to all of this stands in sharp contrast to Mr. Krabs' excitement. Rather than celebrating the fact that the restaurant chaos had been handled so effectively, Squidward remains upset about the whole situation, clearly unhappy that this new employee is now going to be sticking around. Mr. Krabs, caught up in his own excitement and eager to go count the pile of money he just made from the sudden rush of anchovy customers, does not pay much attention to Squidward's complaints. This small moment quietly sets up the dynamic that will carry through the rest of the series, with Squidward stuck working alongside someone whose personality and energy clash completely with his own preference for peace and quiet. The episode does not end quite yet, though. Shortly after SpongeBob gets hired, his best friend Patrick wanders into the restaurant and casually asks for a Krabby Patty of his own. SpongeBob, eager to prove himself in his very first moments as an official employee, rushes back into the kitchen and produces another massive stream of patties. So much food all at once that it ends up hitting Patrick directly and sending him flying straight out of the restaurant. It is a small, silly moment, but it also hints at something important about SpongeBob's approach to his new job. He does not do anything halfway. Whether it is finding an imaginary spatula or making a simple burger for a friend, SpongeBob throws his full energy and effort into every single task, sometimes with results that are a little more chaotic than intended. Worried about what he just witnessed, Squidward calls Mr. Krabs to come see this new employee in action, likely hoping his boss will finally understand why hiring SpongeBob might not have been the best idea. Whether or not Mr. Krabs shares any of those concerns is left unclear by the end of the episode, but given how the rest of the series plays out, it becomes obvious that Mr. Krabs never seriously considers letting SpongeBob go. Whatever chaos might occasionally follow him around, SpongeBob's cooking skill and endless dedication to his job make him far too valuable an employee to lose. Looking back at this entire episode, it becomes clear just how much of a turning point this hiring day really was for the Krusty Krab. Before SpongeBob arrived, the restaurant already had a solid reputation and a steady flow of customers, built built on the strength of that accidental recipe Krabs and Plankton had created years earlier. But it was SpongeBob's arrival that gave the restaurant its most iconic employee, someone whose skill behind the grill would end up becoming just as important to the Krusty Krab's identity as the secret formula itself. There is also something worth noticing about how differently SpongeBob's hiring played out compared to how the restaurant had operated up until this point. Squidward had been hired alongside Jim, another fry cook, filling a role that needed to be filled simply because the restaurant required workers to keep running. SpongeBob's hiring, by contrast, came out of a moment of pure crisis, a flood of hungry anchovies threatening to overwhelm the restaurant completely. He did not simply walk in and get handed a job, the way Squidward and Jim likely had. He had to prove himself, under pressure, in the middle of total chaos, before Mr. Krabs was willing to officially bring him on board. This difference matters because it says something about the kind of employee SpongeBob would go on to become. From his very first day, he was not simply someone filling an empty position. He was someone who had already demonstrated, in the most dramatic way possible, exactly how valuable he could be during a real crisis. That reputation, earned on his very first day working at the restaurant, would end up following him throughout the rest of the series, as SpongeBob continues to prove himself as the one employee capable of keeping the Krusty Krab running smoothly, no matter what kind of trouble comes through the front door. By the end of this pilot episode, the Krusty Krab finally had all three of the employees fans would come to know throughout the rest of the show. Mr. Krab stood as the owner, focused endlessly on money and profit. Squidward remained the reluctant cashier, unhappy with his job, but never quite willing to leave it behind. And now SpongeBob had joined as the fry cook, bringing a level of enthusiasm and skill that neither of his co-workers could match. Together, these three would go on to run the most successful restaurant in all of Bikini Bottom, dealing with everything from ordinary customers to increasingly elaborate schemes cooked up by the restaurant's biggest rival just down the street. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With the full crew now finally in place, the daily rhythm of the Krusty Krab was ready to begin in earnest. But running a successful restaurant is never simply a matter of cooking good food and keeping customers happy. Just next door, someone who had never stopped thinking about that torn recipe and the friendship it destroyed was about to make his presence known in ways that would test SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs again and again for years to come. Section 6. Guarding the Formula. By the time SpongeBob had settled into his job as fry cook, the Krusty Krab had become something more than just a restaurant. It had become a target. Just across the street sat the Chum Bucket, and inside that small, mostly empty building sat a creature who had never once given up on getting back what he believed was rightfully his. Plankton's very first appearance in the show, in an episode simply called Plankton, sets the tone for what would become one of the longest-running patterns in the entire series, a pattern that would repeat itself in one form or another for years and years to come. That first episode begins with something strange happening at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob cooks up a Krabby Patty as usual, but instead of staying still on the counter, the burger appears to move on its own, sliding across the floor toward the front door. Mr. Krabs quickly steps in and reveals the truth behind the moving patty. It was never haunted or alive. It was Plankton, hiding underneath the burger, trying to sneak it out of the restaurant without anyone noticing. Mr. Krabs grabs him, tosses him back across the street to the Chum Bucket, and turns to SpongeBob to explain who this strange little creature actually is and why he keeps causing trouble. This moment matters because it introduces SpongeBob, and by extension the audience, to the central conflict that would define so much of the show going forward. Mr. Krabs explains that Plankton is his business rival, someone who has spent years trying to steal the Krabby Patty's secret formula. At this point in the story, SpongeBob has no idea about the deeper history between Plankton and Mr. Krabs, no knowledge of their shared childhood or the friendship that once tied them together. All he knows is that this tiny green creature is trouble, and that protecting the formula is now part of his job. Later that same night, after the restaurant closes for the day, Plankton tries a different approach. Rather than sneaking in through force, he attempts to trick SpongeBob using kindness, claiming that the two of them are actually friends, and that SpongeBob should bring him a Krabby Patty as a birthday gift. When that fails to work, Plankton takes things a step further, sneaking into SpongeBob's head through a small opening and attaching a mind control device directly to his brain. Under Plankton's control, SpongeBob is forced to walk back to the Krusty Krab, grab a patty, and carry it over to the Chum Bucket, where Plankton plans to analyze it using a machine built by his computer wife, Karen. The plan nearly works, but it falls apart at the last second because of something Plankton did not expect. Rather than simply following orders like a machine, SpongeBob's own love for the Krabby Patty ends up saving the day. Right before he can drop the burger into Karen's analyzing machine, SpongeBob pauses and begins describing just how much he adores the patty, speaking about its taste and texture with real emotion. Plankton, unable to resist the temptation of the burger himself, leaps toward it, misses, and falls straight into the machine, trapping himself inside his own invention. SpongeBob, freed from the mind control the moment Plankton loses focus, simply walks home with the patty still in hand. This first attempt sets the pattern for nearly everything that follows. Plankton comes up with an elaborate plan, something clever or strange, or a little bit desperate, and that plan almost always ends in failure, often due to some small detail Plankton failed to account for. Sometimes it is his own hunger getting the better of him. Sometimes it is SpongeBob's unexpected loyalty to the restaurant. Sometimes it is simply bad luck. Whatever the reason, the outcome tends to stay the same. Plankton fails, the formula stays safe, and life at the Krusty Krab returns to normal until the next scheme comes along. What makes this pattern especially interesting is just how many different schemes Plankton actually tried over the years. According to records kept by longtime fans of the show, Plankton worked through an entire alphabet of failed plans, labeled Plan A all the way through Plan Y, each one a different attempt at getting his hands on the formula or putting the Krusty Krab out of business entirely. Some of these plans involved simple tricks, like sneaking into the restaurant at night to steal a piece of a leftover patty. Other plans grew far more complicated, involving disguises, hidden gadgets, or elaborate traps designed to catch SpongeBob or Mr. Krabs off guard. One particular scheme involved Plankton sneaking into the Krusty Krab after hours and taking a small piece of a patty that SpongeBob had accidentally left behind on the register. Believing he finally had a real sample to analyze, Plankton rushed back to his lab, only for the plan to fall apart when he ended up falling into a fryer, accidentally burning up the very sample he had just stolen. It is a small, almost silly detail, but it captures something true about Plankton's overall track record. Even when he manages to get his hands on something real, some accident or mistake usually ends up ruining his chances before he can actually use it. Not every one of Plankton's plans stayed quite so small in scale. As the years went on and his frustration grew, some of his schemes became far more serious and far-reaching than a simple late-night break-in. At one point, after growing tired of losing to SpongeBob time and time again, Plankton took advantage of a moment when Gary, SpongeBob's beloved pet snail, had been taken far away to a place called Atlantic City by King Poseidon. Rather than helping stop this from happening, Plankton allowed SpongeBob and Patrick to head off on a dangerous journey to save Gary, hoping that sending SpongeBob away might finally clear a path for him to take the formula without interference. This particular plan actually worked for a while, with Mr. Krabs eventually giving up the formula out of guilt and desperation, though Plankton ultimately ends up helping rescue SpongeBob, Patrick, and Gary anyway, showing a rare moment where his conscience gets the better of his greed. Looking across the full stretch of these schemes, a clear pattern starts to emerge about how the Krusty Krab managed to survive so many attacks over so many years. Part of the answer comes down to simple luck, since plenty of Plankton's plans fail due to small accidents, rather than any brilliant defense strategy on Mr. Krabs' part. But a bigger part of the answer comes down to SpongeBob himself. Time and time again, it is SpongeBob's loyalty, his attention to detail, or his sheer dumb luck that ends up saving the formula from falling into the wrong hands. Whether he realizes it or not, SpongeBob has become the single most important line of defense, standing between Plankton and decades worth of stolen recipes. This constant back and forth between Plankton's schemes and their eventual failure became such a regular part of daily life at the Krusty Krab that it practically turned into routine. Employees at most restaurants worry about things like running out of ingredients or dealing with rude customers. At the Krusty Krab, worrying about a tiny green creature sneaking in to steal secret recipes became just as normal a part of the job as flipping burgers or taking orders. SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs all grew accustomed to spotting Plankton's disguises, catching his traps before they could spring, and shutting down his plans almost as quickly as he could come up with them. It is worth remembering that underneath all of these repeated schemes sits the same painful history covered earlier in this story. Plankton was never simply a random villain attacking a stranger's business for no reason. Every Every single plan, no matter how strange or elaborate, traces back to that torn piece of paper from decades earlier, the small and incomplete half of a recipe that left him running a restaurant nobody wanted to visit. Each failed scheme was not just a loss in the moment, it was another reminder of exactly how far apart his life had drifted from the success his childhood best friend had built for himself. This deeper motivation does not excuse the constant break-ins, mind control attempts, and elaborate traps Plankton set throughout the years, but it does help explain why he never simply gave up, even after decades of failure. Most people, after losing the same battle over and over again, might eventually walk away and try something different. Plankton, driven by a mix of stubborn pride and old resentment, never let go of the idea that this formula, or at least some version of it, still belonged to him just as much as it belonged to Mr. Krabs. Over time, the constant threat of Plankton's schemes also shaped how seriously the Krusty Krab treated the protection of its secret recipe. The formula was never simply written down on some easily accessible piece of paper sitting out in the open. It became something guarded closely, known only to a small handful of people, treated with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for far more valuable secrets. This constant need for protection added an extra layer of tension to daily life at the restaurant, turning what might have otherwise been a simple fast food job into something that occasionally felt more like defending a fortress. Despite every scheme, every disguise, and every clever trap Plankton managed to build over the years, the Krusty Krab kept standing strong. Customers kept coming, the formula stayed protected, and Mr. Krabs kept growing richer with each passing year, watching his restaurant's reputation only grow stronger the more often it survived another one of Plankton's attacks. If anything, these repeated failures on Plankton's part likely only added to the restaurant's legend, giving customers even more reason to trust that whatever made the Krabby Patty so special would remain safe no matter how many times someone tried to steal it away. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Still, surviving countless small-scale schemes over the years was one thing. Facing a threat serious enough to actually put the entire restaurant's future in danger would turn out to be something else entirely. As the Krusty Krab continued growing in size and popularity, bigger opportunities and bigger risks eventually followed, opening the door for a new restaurant expansion that would bring both new success and, once again, a chance for the restaurant's oldest rival to strike in ways nobody at the Krusty Krab had ever faced before. Section 7. Krusty Krab 2 and the Stolen Crown. Years of steady growth, endless customers, and countless failed attempts by Plankton to steal the formula eventually led Mr. Krabs to a decision that would change the shape of his business forever. After building the original Krusty Krab into the single most successful restaurant in all of Bikini Bottom, Mr. Krabs decided it was time to expand. Rather than staying content with one location, no matter how popular it had become, he set his sights on something bigger. He planned to open a second restaurant, right next door to the first, calling it the Krusty Krab 2. For an employee as dedicated and hardworking as SpongeBob, news of this expansion came with an exciting possibility. SpongeBob had spent years working as the Krusty Krab's fry cook, earning the title of Employee of the Month more times than almost anyone could count, and pouring every bit of his energy into making sure the restaurant ran as smoothly as possible. With a brand new restaurant opening up, SpongeBob believed this was finally his chance to move up, to become the manager of this new location, and prove that all his years of hard work had been building towards something bigger than just flipping patties behind a grill. The opening ceremony for Krusty Krab 2 arrived, and SpongeBob showed up expecting this dream to finally come true. Instead, Mr. Krabs announced that Squidward Tentacles, not SpongeBob, would be taking over as manager of the new restaurant. Mr. Krabs explained his reasoning simply enough, saying that Squidward was more mature and better suited to handle the responsibility, while SpongeBob, in his eyes, was still just a kid who was not ready for that kind of role. For someone who had given so much of himself to the Krusty Krab over the years, being passed over like this in front of the entire town must have felt like a real blow, and it left SpongeBob deeply disappointed. That night, heartbroken over the missed promotion, SpongeBob headed to his favorite ice cream restaurant, a place called Goofy Goobers, where he tried to drown his sorrows alongside his best friend Patrick. The two of them ended up so overloaded on ice cream that they woke up the next morning with what could only be described as a serious hangover, feeling sick and groggy from everything they had eaten the night before. It was not exactly SpongeBob's finest morning, but it captured just how much that missed opportunity had hurt him. While SpongeBob SpongeBob was busy nursing his ice cream hangover, something far more serious was unfolding elsewhere in Bikini Bottom. Plankton, still bitter after years of failed schemes and still chasing the same formula he had been chasing for decades, decided it was finally time to try something bigger than any plan he had attempted before. Rather than sneaking into the Krusty Krab late at night or disguising himself as a hidden patty, Plankton set his sights on something far more ambitious. He planned to steal the crown belonging to King Neptune, the powerful ruler of the entire ocean, and use that theft to bring down Mr. Krabs once and for all. Plankton's plan, sometimes referred to by fans as Plan Z, was built around deception rather than direct confrontation. Rather than stealing the crown for himself outright, Plankton arranged things so that all the evidence pointed toward Mr. Krabs as the thief. He carried out the theft quietly during the night, planting false clues that would lead King Neptune straight to the Krusty Krab's doorstep, all while sending the real crown far away to a dangerous and mysterious place known as Shell City, a location so remote and feared that no sea creature who traveled there had ever been known to return. The next morning, King Neptune, furious over his missing crown, stormed straight into the newly opened Krusty Krab 2 to confront Mr. Krabs directly. The timing could not have been worse. Just as SpongeBob and Patrick were stumbling in from their rough night of overindulgence, they found themselves walking straight into the middle of this unfolding crisis. Neptune, backed by the false evidence Plankton had planted, accused Mr. Krabs of stealing his crown, and given how convincing the setup appeared, Mr. Krabs found himself with almost no way to defend his own innocence. Still groggy from the night before, SpongeBob initially made things worse rather than better, accidentally speaking poorly of Mr. Krabs in front of Neptune before realizing the seriousness of what was actually happening. Once he understood the danger his boss was truly in, SpongeBob's loyalty kicked back into gear. Despite everything that had happened the day before, despite being passed over for the promotion he had wanted so badly, SpongeBob stepped forward and made a promise to Neptune. He vowed to travel to Shell City himself and bring back the missing crown, whatever the cost, in order to save Mr. Krabs from Neptune's wrath. Neptune agreed to give SpongeBob a chance, though he made the stakes brutally clear. He would freeze Mr. Krabs in place, holding him in a kind of suspended punishment, giving SpongeBob and Patrick a limited number of days to retrieve the crown before Neptune's patience ran out completely. If they failed to return in time, or failed to bring back the crown at all, Mr. Krabs' fate would be sealed. This was no longer just about missing out on a promotion, or dealing with another one of Plankton's small-time schemes. This was a genuine, life-threatening crisis, and the entire future of the Krusty Krab now rested on whether two friends could complete a dangerous journey across unfamiliar waters. While SpongeBob and Patrick set out on their mission, Plankton wasted no time taking advantage of Mr. Krab's frozen, helpless state. With the one man capable of protecting the secret recipe now completely unable to act, Plankton finally succeeded in doing something he had failed at for decades. He stole the actual Krabby Patty formula, walking away with the one thing he had chased relentlessly since the days when that torn recipe first split his friendship with Krabs apart. After decades of failed schemes, disguises, mind control attempts, and elaborate traps that never quite worked, Plankton had finally gotten exactly what he wanted, all because the timing of his crown theft had left the Krusty Krab defenseless at the worst possible moment. Rather than simply enjoying his long-awaited victory quietly, Plankton immediately put the stolen formula to work, using it to sell his own version of Krabby Patties at the Chum Bucket for the very first time in the restaurant's history. But there was a dark twist hidden inside his plan. Along with each patty he sold, Plankton handed out a strange bucket-shaped helmet to every customer who bought one. These helmets, rather than being some harmless promotional gift, actually placed anyone who wore them under Plankton's direct mind control, turning ordinary citizens of Bikini Bottom into obedient slaves forced to build a massive monument in Plankton's honor. This single decision revealed just how far Plankton was willing to go once he finally got what he wanted. This was no longer a simple business rivalry over who made the better burger. Plankton had turned his lifelong obsession into something with the power to enslave an entire town, using the very formula that once defined his childhood friendship as the tool to control the same people who had once looked down on him. Whatever bitterness had built up over decades of failure and rejection seemed to explode all at once, transforming a small-time restaurant rival into something closer to a genuine threat to all of Bikini Bottom. Meanwhile, far away from all of this chaos, SpongeBob SpongeBob and Patrick were making their way through the dangers of Shell City, determined to find Neptune's crown and bring it home in time to save Mr. Krabs. Their journey took them through unfamiliar and often frightening territory, testing both their courage and their friendship in ways neither of them had ever experienced before. Eventually, against incredible odds, the two of them managed to locate the crown, though their troubles were far from over even after finding it. Getting the crown safely back to Bikini Bottom proved to be its own challenge, one that required help from an unexpected source. A famous lifeguard, appearing in the story as a live-action character rather than an animated one, agreed to help carry SpongeBob and Patrick back home, swimming with incredible speed across the open water. This unusual partnership between the animated undersea world and a real-life human character became one of the most memorable and unusual moments in the entire history of the franchise, blending two completely different styles of storytelling into a single, high-stakes rescue mission. The rescue arrived just in time. SpongeBob and Patrick were launched back down toward Bikini Bottom at incredible speed, crashing directly through the roof of the Krusty Krab 2 at the exact moment King Neptune had raised his weapon to strike down Mr. Krabs for good. The crown itself ended up playing a direct role in saving Mr. Krabs' life, deflecting the powerful blast Neptune had aimed at him just in the nick of time. It was an incredibly close call, arriving with only seconds to spare before Mr. Krabs would have paid the ultimate price for a crime he never actually committed. With the crown safely returned and Mr. Krabs' innocence finally confirmed, it seemed as though the entire crisis had come to a close. Neptune was overjoyed to be reunited with his crown, and everyone present began celebrating the successful rescue mission that SpongeBob and Patrick had somehow managed to pull off against all odds. But the celebration did not last very long. Plankton, watching this entire scene unfold, was not ready to accept defeat quite so easily. Rather than slipping away quietly after his earlier success with the stolen formula, he revealed one final trick still hidden up his sleeve. Using a massive, oversized version of his mind control helmet, Plankton managed to place King Neptune himself under his control, turning the very ruler of the ocean into his newest puppet. This moment raised the stakes of the entire conflict to a level nobody at the Krusty Krab had ever faced before. This was no longer just about protecting a secret recipe or defending a restaurant from a rival's scheme. Plankton now had control over one of the most powerful beings in the entire ocean, giving him a level of influence far beyond anything he had ever managed to achieve through his decades of smaller, failed plans. Ultimately, SpongeBob, Patrick, and the rest of Bikini Bottom found a way to break Plankton's control and put an end to his brief reign of power, restoring order to the town and finally bringing this entire ordeal to a close. Mr. Krabs, cleared of any wrongdoing and reunited with his rescued reputation, was able to return to running his restaurants without the shadow of Neptune's accusations hanging over him. The Krusty Krab 2, despite opening under such chaotic and dangerous circumstances, remained standing as a second successful location for Mr. Krabs' growing business empire. Looking back at everything that happened during this stretch of the Krusty Krab's history, it becomes clear just how much more serious the stakes had grown compared to earlier years. What began as a simple business expansion, a second restaurant opening right next door to the original, ended up spiraling into one of the most dangerous crises the Krusty Krab had ever faced, involving royal accusations, an ocean-wide crown theft, and Plankton's first and only real success in stealing the formula after decades of failed attempts. Every earlier scheme covered in this story had ended quickly and quietly, contained within the walls of the restaurant itself. This crisis, by contrast, pulled in an entire kingdom, stretched across dangerous, unknown waters, and came dangerously close to costing Mr. Krabs his life. This chapter also revealed something important about SpongeBob's character that had been building since his very first day working at the restaurant. Even after being passed over for a promotion he had wanted desperately, even after spending the night before drowning his disappointment in ice cream, SpongeBob still stepped forward without hesitation the moment his boss's life was truly in danger. His loyalty to Mr. Krabs and to the Krusty Krab clearly ran deeper than any single disappointment, no matter how painful that disappointment might have felt in the moment. This willingness to risk everything for the sake of the restaurant and the people connected to it would continue to define SpongeBob's role at the Krusty Krab for years to come. By the time this entire crisis finally settled, the Krusty Krab had grown into something bigger bigger and more complicated than the humble trailer it had started out as decades earlier. It now stood as two separate locations, both successful, both carrying the same secret recipe that had once torn apart a childhood friendship. Plankton, despite his brief taste of real success, ended up right back where he started. Formula lost once again, control over Neptune broken, and his restaurant just as empty as it had always been. Yet even after this massive defeat, nothing about his determination seemed to change. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As successful and secure as the Krusty Krab appeared after surviving this dramatic crisis, its future was far from guaranteed. New challenges, some coming from unexpected directions entirely outside of Plankton's usual schemes, were still waiting further down the road. One such challenge would eventually threaten to tear down the very ground the restaurant stood on, testing everything Mr. Krabs and his employees had built over so many years in a way that had nothing to do with stolen recipes or ocean royalty at all. Section 8. The Highway That Nearly Ended It. After surviving a crisis involving a stolen crown, a furious ocean king, and a rival who had finally managed to steal the secret formula for the first time in decades, it might seem like nothing else could threaten the Krusty Krab in quite the same way again. But the next major challenge facing Mr. Krabs' restaurant would not come from another elaborate scheme built around mind control or disguises. It would come from something far more ordinary, and in some ways, far more dangerous. A construction project that threatened to reshape the entire landscape surrounding both the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket for good. The episode that tells this story is called SpongeBob's Last Stand, and it begins on a peaceful day at one of SpongeBob's favorite places in all of Bikini Bottom, a wide open area filled with drifting jellyfish known as Jellyfish Fields. SpongeBob and Patrick spend much of their free time in this area, catching jellyfish for fun and simply enjoying the peaceful open space that Jellyfish Fields provides. For SpongeBob, this location means more than just a place to relax. It represents one of the few untouched natural spots left in a town that otherwise revolves so heavily around business, restaurants, and the constant hum of everyday city life. On this particular day, SpongeBob and Patrick stumble across something that immediately threatens everything they love about this peaceful spot. A sign has been placed announcing plans for a massive new construction project called the Shelly Superhighway, set to be built directly through the middle of Jellyfish Fields. For two friends who spend so much of their time enjoying this open space, the idea of it being paved over and destroyed to make room for a highway feels like an immediate and serious threat, one they cannot simply ignore. Rather than sitting back and letting this happen without a fight, SpongeBob decides to take action. He begins reaching out to people around town, hoping to build enough support to stop the construction before it can ever begin. This decision reveals something important about SpongeBob's character, beyond his usual role as a hardworking fry cook. Given a cause he genuinely cares about, something that goes beyond his daily job at the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob proves himself willing to stand up and fight for what he believes matters, even when that fight puts him at odds with people who might otherwise support him in other situations. Unfortunately for SpongeBob, his efforts to rally support around town do not go the way he hopes. Nobody else in Bikini Bottom seems to share his concern about losing Jellyfish Fields. Whether out of simple indifference or genuine excitement about a brand new highway coming to town, the citizens of Bikini Bottom largely brush aside SpongeBob's warnings, leaving him and Patrick as two of the only voices speaking out against the project. Faced with a wall of disinterest from nearly everyone he approaches, SpongeBob heads to work at the Krusty Krab, still carrying the weight of this unresolved problem, hoping that maybe his boss might offer the support nobody else in town seemed willing to give. At the restaurant, SpongeBob explains the situation to Mr. Krabs, hoping his boss will understand why saving Jellyfish Fields matters so much. At first, this hope seems to pay off. Mr. Krabs agrees to help, and SpongeBob feels a wave of relief knowing that at least one person in town is willing to stand beside him in this fight. That relief does not last very long. As soon as Mr. Krabs learns the actual details of what SpongeBob is asking him to oppose, his enthusiasm completely flips. Rather than seeing the highway as a threat, Mr. Krabs sees it as an opportunity, believing that a brand new road running through the area could bring in a fresh wave of customers eager to stop by the Krusty Krab on their way through town. This moment captures something important about Mr. Krabs' character that has remained consistent since the earliest days of his business. No matter how loyal he might be to his employees, employees in certain moments, no matter how many times he has stood up against Plankton to protect his restaurant. Mr. Krab's decisions almost always trace back to one single motivating factor: the potential for making more money. A highway bringing more customers directly to his restaurant's doorstep sounds, from a purely financial perspective, like exactly the kind of opportunity Mr. Krabs would never want to pass up, regardless of what it might cost the natural landscape surrounding his business. SpongeBob, clearly disappointed but not yet ready to give up, decides to show Mr. Krabs the actual blueprint for the planned highway, hoping that seeing the details laid out clearly might change his boss's mind. This decision turns out to be exactly the right move. As SpongeBob unfolds the full diagram, revealing the highway's planned path in complete detail, Mr. Krabs is horrified to discover that the road does not just pass somewhere near jellyfish fields. According to the blueprint, the highway is set to run directly over the Krusty Krab itself, a detail Mr. Krabs had clearly never considered when he first heard about the project. Even more shocking than seeing his own restaurant marked for destruction, Mr. Krabs discovers exactly who is behind this entire highway project. According to the blueprint, the plan has been approved and sponsored by Sheldon J. Plankton Enterprises, a division of a larger company called No Fun Incorporated. This revelation changes everything for Mr. Krabs almost instantly. What had originally sounded like an exciting business opportunity now reveals itself as something far more sinister, a carefully disguised scheme designed by his oldest rival to destroy the Krusty Krab entirely, while making it look like nothing more than an ordinary infrastructure project. Once Mr. Krabs understands the full picture, his attitude toward the highway flips completely. Rather than supporting the project for the sake of potential profit, he now stands firmly alongside SpongeBob, furious at the realization that Plankton has been working behind the scenes this entire time to bring down the Krusty Krab, using something as seemingly harmless as a road construction plan. Together, Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob head straight to the chum bucket, ready to confront Plankton directly about what they have just discovered. At the chum bucket, Plankton makes no attempt to hide or deny his involvement in the project. Rather than showing any sign of guilt or hesitation, he confirms everything Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob suspected, revealing that the entire highway has already been approved by the rest of the town. According to Plankton, the citizens of Bikini Bottom voted unanimously in favor of the Shelly Superhighway, meaning the project is already moving forward with full public support, regardless of what Mr. Krabs or SpongeBob might think about it now. To make matters even more painful, it turns out that Mr. Krabs himself had unknowingly agreed to the project earlier, having voted in favor of it without realizing what the plan actually entailed. This detail adds an extra layer of frustration to the entire situation. Mr. Krabs, so focused on his usual instincts around potential profit, had accidentally helped approve the very project now threatening to destroy his own restaurant, all without bothering to look closely at what he was actually agreeing to. It is a small but important reminder that Mr. Krabs' greed, while it has helped build his business into something successful over the years, can just as easily work against him when it clouds his judgment about decisions that matter. With the highway already approved and construction moving forward regardless of their objections, SpongeBob and Patrick refuse to simply give up. Rather than accepting defeat, the two of them decide to take their fight directly to the public, printing out flyers and going door to door around Bikini Bottom in an attempt to convince people to reconsider their support for the project. This attempt at peaceful protest, however well-intentioned, does not go the way they hope. Instead of listening to their concerns, the citizens of Bikini Bottom respond with outright hostility, some of them even throwing SpongeBob and Patrick's own flyers back at them as a way of rejecting their message entirely. Rather than backing down after this rejection, SpongeBob and Patrick continue pushing forward with their protest, hoping that persistence alone might eventually change public opinion. Unfortunately for them, their continued efforts eventually catch the attention of local authorities, who step in and forcibly remove the two of them from the area, effectively banning them from continuing their protest anywhere near the construction site. Watching their beloved jellyfish fields threatened, and now finding themselves physically prevented from doing anything further to stop it, SpongeBob and Patrick are left standing on the sidelines as construction on the Shelly Superhighway moves forward without any further resistance from either of them. What follows next marks one of the darkest turning points in this entire story. With no one left standing in his way, Plankton moves forward with construction at full speed, using heavy machinery to tear straight through what was once a peaceful, open area filled with drifting jellyfish. The transformation happens quickly and brutally. Jellyfish Fields, once a place of quiet, natural beauty where SpongeBob and Patrick spent countless afternoons simply enjoying themselves, becomes nothing more than a barren, lifeless stretch of pavement and pollution, completely unrecognizable from what it once was. The effects of this destruction ripple outward almost immediately, touching far more than just the physical landscape of the area. Bikini Bottom itself begins suffering from the pollution generated by this massive new highway, with the surrounding environment growing increasingly dirty and unpleasant as construction wraps up and traffic begins flowing through. What had seemed like a simple business opportunity to bring more customers into town instead brought consequences that nobody besides SpongeBob had bothered to consider ahead of time. For the Krusty Krab specifically, the consequences of this new highway turn out to be the exact opposite of what Mr. Krabs originally hoped for. Rather than funneling new customers directly toward his restaurant, the highway ends up running straight past the Krusty Krab and continuing on toward the Chum Bucket instead, effectively diverting traffic away from Mr. Krabs' business and directly toward his rival's restaurant. This detail reveals the true cruelty hidden inside Plankton's entire scheme from the very beginning. The highway was never designed to help anyone in Bikini Bottom. It existed solely as a tool built to funnel customers away from the Krusty Krab and straight into the Chum Bucket instead, finally giving Plankton the kind of steady customer base he had been unable to build for himself through decades of failed attempts to steal the formula directly. As the highway's true purpose becomes clear, business at the Krusty Krab begins declining rapidly. Customers who once lined up daily for a taste of the Krabby Patty now find themselves drawn toward the newly accessible Chum Bucket instead, simply because the highway makes it the more convenient option to reach. For a restaurant that had spent years, possibly decades, building its reputation as the single most successful business in all of Bikini Bottom, watching that success slip away almost overnight because of one carefully engineered highway must have felt like an entirely new kind of threat, one that had nothing to do with stolen recipes or disguised intruders sneaking around after hours. The pressure of this sudden decline eventually pushes Mr. Krabs to a breaking point nobody could have predicted just a short time earlier. Faced with the very real possibility of losing his entire business permanently, Mr. Krabs makes a decision that would have seemed almost unthinkable earlier in this story. He decides that his only remaining option is to sell the secret Krabby Patty formula directly to Plankton, giving up the one thing he had spent his entire life protecting in exchange for whatever money he might still be able to salvage from the situation. This moment represents one of the lowest points the Krusty Krab has ever faced throughout its entire history. After surviving countless schemes, after protecting the formula through decades of attempted thefts, disguises, and elaborate traps, it was not some clever trick or dangerous machine that finally pushed Mr. Krabs toward giving up the recipe voluntarily. It was simple economic pressure, the slow and steady loss of customers caused by a highway built with the specific purpose of destroying his business from a distance, rather than attacking it directly. Just as Mr. Krabs prepares to hand over the formula and finally give Plankton the victory he had been chasing for so long, something entirely unexpected intervenes and changes the entire course of events. The jellyfish that once called Jellyfish Fields home, displaced and angered by the destruction of their natural habitat, suddenly swarm into the area, invading the Chum Bucket at the exact moment Mr. Krabs is preparing to complete the sale. Rather than continuing calmly with the transaction, chaos breaks out as the jellyfish begin attacking everyone in the building, forcing Mr. Krabs to flee the scene entirely, while Plankton finds himself caught directly in the middle of the swarm, getting repeatedly stung as the furious jellyfish take out their anger on the person responsible for destroying their home. This sudden jellyfish invasion ends up sparing the Krusty Krab from what would have otherwise been a devastating and permanent loss. Had the sale gone through as planned, Plankton would have finally achieved the one goal he had spent decades chasing, gaining full control over the formula that built his rival's entire empire. Instead, this unexpected natural disruption interrupts the transaction at the very last possible moment, giving the Krusty Krab an unexpected second chance it had not earned through any clever plan or careful strategy of its own. The jellyfish swarm does not stop with just this one dramatic rescue. Rather than settling down after disrupting the sale, the angry jellyfish continue attacking the surrounding area for several days afterward, creating enough chaos and disruption that local news stations begin covering the story as a major event unfolding across the entire town. This continued jellyfish assault ends up drawing attention back to the highway itself, forcing the citizens of Bikini Bottom to finally finally confront the consequences of a decision they had approved without fully understanding what they were agreeing to. Seeing this shift in public attention, SpongeBob recognizes an opportunity to finally turn the tide of public opinion back in his favor. Using the ongoing news coverage as a platform, SpongeBob makes a direct appeal to the citizens of Bikini Bottom, urging them to reconsider their support for the highway and to help him tear it down before any more damage can be done. This time, unlike his earlier attempts at protest, SpongeBob's message finally begins to resonate. Faced with days of chaotic jellyfish attacks and a clear demonstration of the environmental destruction the highway has caused, the same citizens who once threw SpongeBob's flyers back in his face now find themselves reconsidering their earlier support. Encouraged by this shift in public opinion, SpongeBob decides it is finally time to take direct action against the highway itself. He climbs onto one of Plankton's construction vehicles, a heavy paver machine originally used to help build the road, and attempts to use it to tear the highway apart before more damage can be done. Plankton, despite having been stung repeatedly by the jellyfish just days earlier, appears determined to defend his creation, confronting SpongeBob and boasting that the highway he built is completely indestructible, confident that nothing SpongeBob attempts will be able to undo what he has already accomplished. This confrontation between SpongeBob and Plankton marks the final showdown of this entire crisis, a direct clash between the sponge, who refused to give up on protecting something he cared about, and the rival who had spent this entire story trying to destroy the Krusty Krab through means far more indirect and sneaky than any of his earlier, more obvious schemes. Where previous battles between SpongeBob and Plankton usually took place inside the walls of the Krusty Krab itself, this final confrontation happens out in the open, on the very road that Plankton had built specifically to bring down his rival's business from a distance. With the support of the citizens of Bikini Bottom finally back on his side, and with the momentum of days' worth of jellyfish-fueled chaos still working in his favor, SpongeBob manages to succeed where his earlier efforts had failed. Despite Plankton's confidence in his so-called indestructible highway, the combined efforts of SpongeBob and the newly rallied town prove strong enough to finally bring the entire structure down, tearing apart the road that had threatened to permanently reshape jellyfish fields and destroy the Krusty Krab's business for good. With the highway finally destroyed, Jellyfish Fields is given a chance to recover and return to something closer to its original natural state. The pollution that had spread throughout Bikini Bottom during construction begins to clear, and the jellyfish, no longer displaced from their destroyed habitat, are finally able to settle back into the peaceful area they once called home. For SpongeBob, this outcome represents more than just a victory over Plankton. It represents proof that standing up for something he genuinely cared about, even when nobody else in town seemed willing to listen at first, could eventually make a real difference, given enough persistence and the right circumstances. For the Krusty Krab itself, this crisis represents an entirely different kind of threat compared to everything covered earlier in this story. Every previous challenge the restaurant faced, from Plankton's early disguises to the theft of the formula during the Neptune crisis, involved some kind of direct attack, a scheme aimed straight at the restaurant or the recipe itself. The Shelley superhighway crisis worked differently, threatening the Krusty Krab through indirect economic pressure, rather than any kind of direct theft or confrontation. Rather than trying to steal the formula outright, Plankton had instead tried to strangle the Krusty Krab's business slowly, cutting off its customer base piece by piece until Mr. Krabs had no choice but to consider giving up the very thing he had spent his entire life protecting. This shift in strategy reveals something important about how far Plankton was willing to go after decades of failed direct attempts. Having tried nearly every trick imaginable to steal the formula through force or deception, Plankton eventually turned towards something far more calculated and patient, using an entire construction project and months, possibly years of planning to attack the Krusty Krab's foundation rather than its front door. This particular scheme came closer to actually succeeding than almost any other plan covered so far in the story, proving that Plankton's greatest threat to the Krusty Krab was never really about clever gadgets or elaborate disguises. It was about patience and a willingness to attack the restaurant's survival through means that had nothing to do with sneaking around in the middle of the night. Mr. Krabs, for his part, walked away from this crisis, having learned an uncomfortable lesson about his own weaknesses. His initial support for the highway, driven entirely by the promise of potential profit, nearly cost him everything he had spent his life building. It took SpongeBob's persistence and a healthy dose of unexpected unexpected help from an army of angry jellyfish to save the Krusty Krab from a mistake that Mr. Krabs himself had unknowingly helped set into motion. Whether this experience changed Mr. Krabs' priorities in any lasting way remains unclear, given how consistently his focus on money continues to drive his decisions throughout the rest of the show's history. But at least for this one crisis, the lesson arrived just in time to save his restaurant from permanent ruin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As jellyfish fields slowly returned to normal and life at the Krusty Krab settled back into its usual rhythm, the restaurant had once again proven its ability to survive even the most unexpected and indirect threats thrown its way. Yet surviving a highway built to strangle its business quietly was one thing. An even bigger threat, one capable of wiping out the formula and the restaurant's entire foundation in a single dramatic stroke, was still waiting somewhere further down the road, ready to test the Krusty Krab in ways far more extreme than anything it had faced up to this point. Section 9. The Vanishing Formula and the Wasteland Future. Every threat the Krusty Krab had faced up to this point came from somewhere inside Bikini Bottom itself. Plankton's schemes, the highway crisis, even the stolen crown that nearly cost Mr. Krabs his life, all traced back to conflicts happening within the same underwater world SpongeBob had always called home. The next major event in the Krusty Krab's history would break that pattern entirely, bringing a threat from somewhere completely outside the ocean, a threat so severe that it would end up reshaping the entire town into something unrecognizable. This part of the story comes from a movie called The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge Out of Water, released years after the first film, and it introduces a villain unlike anyone the Krusty Krab had dealt with before. Rather than another undersea rival driven by decades of personal history, this new threat came from the surface world above the ocean in the form of a pirate named Burgerbeard. Burgerbeard discovers a strange and powerful book while traveling to a place called Bikini Atoll, a book with an incredible and dangerous ability. Whatever gets written down on its pages instantly becomes real, giving whoever holds it an almost unlimited amount of control over the story unfolding around them. As it turns out, the very story being written inside this magical book is the story of SpongeBob and his life in Bikini Bottom. This detail adds a strange new layer to everything happening at the Krusty Krab, suggesting that the entire world SpongeBob and his friends live in might somehow exist as a story being told through this book, with Burgerbeard now holding the pen capable of changing that story however he pleases. For a restaurant that had spent years defending itself against schemes hatched by familiar rivals like Plankton, facing a threat capable of rewriting reality itself represented something on an entirely different scale. Before Burgerbeard's arrival, life at the Krusty Krab had settled into the same rhythm fans had grown used to over the years. SpongeBob continued working happily as the restaurant's fry cook, taking pride in protecting the secret Krabby Patty formula from Plankton, just as he always had. According to the story, SpongeBob had spent several years by this point, faithfully guarding the recipe, treating it as one of his most important responsibilities, even as the daily grind of countless failed theft attempts from Plankton had become almost routine. Using the power of his magical book, Burgerbeard writes himself directly into the story of Bikini Bottom, giving himself the ability to steal the Krabby Patty formula in a single dramatic stroke. Unlike Plankton's decades of failed schemes, sneaking around at night or disguising himself as a moving patty, Burgerbeard simply writes the theft into existence, bypassing every single defense the Krusty Krab had ever relied upon. In an instant, the formula that had survived so many attacks over so many years disappears completely, taken by a villain who did not even need to set foot inside Bikini Bottom to succeed. The consequences of this theft hit Bikini Bottom almost immediately, and they hit far harder than anything the town had experienced during any of Plankton's earlier schemes. Without the Krabby Patty formula, the Krusty Krab has nothing left to sell, and the effects of this loss ripple outward across the entire town at a speed nobody could have predicted. Bikini Bottom, a place that had built so much of its daily life and culture around this one particular food, quickly collapses into chaos once that food disappears completely. Within what feels like almost no time at all, Bikini Bottom transforms into something closer to a lawless wasteland than the cheerful underwater town fans had known throughout the rest of the series. Citizens who once lined up peacefully for a taste of the Krabby Patty now find themselves desperate and disorganized, with society breaking down rapidly in the absence of the one food that had held so much of daily daily life together. This transformation reveals just how deeply the Krabby Patty had become woven into the very fabric of Bikini Bottom's existence, far beyond simply being a popular menu item at one successful restaurant. Amid this chaos, an unexpected piece of the story lands directly in the life of Sandy Cheeks, SpongeBob's squirrel friend, who normally lives inside a protective dome filled with air rather than water. During a scuffle between Burger Beard and a group of seagulls following him, a single page torn from the magical book ends up drifting through the ocean before eventually landing on top of Sandy's tree dome. This page, carrying whatever strange power the rest of the book possesses, causes Sandy to become convinced that what she is looking at must be some kind of message sent by what she describes as sandwich gods, sending her into a state of confusion that leaves her acting strangely for the rest of the story. Faced with an entire town falling apart around him and no clear plan for how to fix things, SpongeBob makes a decision that surprises almost everyone around him. Rather than continuing to see Plankton purely as an enemy, SpongeBob proposes that the two of them team up, working together instead of against each other, in order to recover the missing formula before the chaos spreading through Bikini Bottom grows completely out of control. Given the decades of conflict between these two characters, built on everything from a childhood friendship that fell apart to countless failed theft attempts over the years, this proposal represents an enormous shift in how SpongeBob approaches his oldest rival. Plankton, surprisingly, agrees to the idea, though understanding exactly what teamwork means does not come easily to him. SpongeBob spends time trying to explain the basic concept, attempting to help Plankton understand why working together toward a shared goal might actually succeed where decades of scheming alone never could. This attempt to teach Plankton about cooperation becomes one of the more unusual and heartfelt threads running through this part of the story, showing a side of their relationship that had rarely been explored during all their earlier conflicts. With an uneasy partnership now in place, SpongeBob and Plankton decide their best chance at fixing things involves traveling backward in time to the exact moment before the formula disappeared, hoping to prevent the theft from ever happening in the first place. In order to build a machine capable of this kind of time travel, the two of them need a power source strong enough to make it work, and they settle on an unlikely choice: Plankton's own computer wife, Karen. The two of them head to the chum bucket, specifically to bring Karen along, planning to use her as the energy source needed to power their time machine. Working together, SpongeBob and Plankton manage to assemble this time machine using whatever parts and materials they can gather, eventually setting it up inside an old abandoned taco restaurant that had clearly been left behind long before this story began. Once the machine is ready, the two of them activate it, hoping to travel back to the exact moment right before Burger Beard's theft took place. Instead, something goes wrong with their calculations, and rather than landing safely in the recent past, SpongeBob and Plankton find themselves flung far into the future instead, arriving at a point in time much further ahead than either of them ever intended to visit. This unplanned trip into the future introduces one of the strangest and most unexpected elements found anywhere throughout this entire story. Rather than landing in some ordinary version of the future, SpongeBob and Plankton find themselves face to face with a character named Bubbles, a magical dolphin who describes himself as an overseer responsible for looking after the entire galaxy. Bubbles represents something completely different from anything else covered throughout this story so far, existing somewhere between a guide and an accidental disruption to whatever cosmic responsibilities he normally handles. During their brief time in this distant future setting, SpongeBob and Plankton accidentally cause Bubbles to lose his position as Galaxy Overseer, an unusual side effect of arriving unannounced into a timeline they were never supposed to visit in the first place. This strange detour adds another layer to just how far-reaching the consequences of Burger Beard's theft had become. What started as a simple robbery back in Bikini Bottom had somehow rippled outward far enough to disrupt events happening in a completely different point in time altogether, suggesting that whatever power the magical book held reached far beyond just the immediate town where the story began. Even more revealing, while stuck in this distant future timeline, SpongeBob and Plankton discover that the Bikini Bottom of this future setting has also suffered through some version of the exact same disaster they are trying to prevent back in their own time. This particular detail matters a great deal for anyone trying to understand what this glimpse of the future actually reveals about the Krusty Krab and the formula's importance. Even generations later, in a future far removed from anything covered earlier in this story, the loss of the Krabby Patty formula formula still leads to famine and hardship, suggesting that this single recipe carries a kind of importance to Bikini Bottom that stretches across generations rather than simply affecting the present moment. Eventually, after their strange detour through this future timeline, SpongeBob and Plankton manage to make their way back closer to the moment they originally intended to visit, hoping to finally recover the missing formula before returning home. Their attempt to retrieve the formula, however, does not go as smoothly as either of them hoped. Rather than successfully preventing the theft or recovering the real recipe, the two of them discover that what they managed to grab turns out to be nothing more than a fake version that Plankton himself had once left behind, a leftover piece from one of his earlier failed schemes, rather than the genuine formula they were actually searching for. This failure marks an important turning point in the story, showing that even with teamwork, even with a working time machine and cooperation between two lifelong rivals, some problems cannot simply be solved through cleverness alone. The entire plan, built around traveling back in time and recovering the formula through careful strategy, ends up falling apart, leaving SpongeBob and Plankton right back where they started, still stuck in a version of Bikini Bottom, suffering under the weight of Burger Beard's theft, with no clear solutions still in hand. What finally breaks this stalemate has nothing to do with time travel, clever machines, or careful planning at all. Instead, the resolution comes down to something far simpler and far more personal. SpongeBob, despite every setback the two of them have faced throughout this entire ordeal, suddenly catches a familiar scent drifting through the air, the unmistakable smell of a real Krabby Patty cooking somewhere nearby. Rather than relying on any strategy or plan, it is simply SpongeBob's deep personal connection to the formula and everything it represents that ends up leading them toward Burger Beard's actual location. Following this scent leads SpongeBob and his friends directly to Burger Beard himself, who has been using the stolen formula to sell his own version of Krabby Patties, this time transporting them using a modified food truck built out of his own pirate ship. Confronting Burger Beard directly finally sets up the true climax of this entire story, bringing SpongeBob face to face with the villain responsible for tearing apart everything he had spent years protecting back at the Krusty Krab. Rather than facing Burger Beard alone, SpongeBob and his closest friends, including Patrick, Squidward, Sandy, and even Plankton himself, transform themselves using powers granted by the very same magical book that had caused so much destruction throughout this story. Each of them takes on a unique superhero identity for this final confrontation, with SpongeBob becoming known as Invincibubble, Patrick transforming into Mr. Super Awesomeness, Squidward becoming Sour Note, Sandy taking on the name The Rodent, and Mr. Krabs himself joining the fight as Sir Pinch-A-Lot. Even Plankton, who spent so much of this story as an uneasy and unfamiliar ally, eventually joins the final battle under the name Plankton, using his newfound understanding of teamwork to help rather than hinder the fight against Burger Beard. This final battle represents something the Krusty Krab had never experienced throughout any of its earlier history covered in this story. Rather than a quiet confrontation happening within the walls of the restaurant, or even the larger-scale crisis involving King Neptune and a stolen crown, this fight against Burger Beard takes place with the entire group of friends and former rivals working together as something closer to a superhero team, using powers drawn directly from the same magical source that had caused their crisis in the first place. During the battle, the group manages to destroy the magical book itself, cutting off whatever power had allowed Burger Beard to rewrite reality throughout this entire ordeal. Even without the book's power, Burger Beard proves to be a difficult opponent, managing to overpower the entire group at various points throughout the fight, despite losing his most dangerous weapon. It ultimately takes the combined efforts of everyone involved, including Plankton's unexpected contribution as Plankton, to finally bring Burger Beard down and put an end to his reign over Bikini Bottom's stolen formula. With Burger Beard finally defeated, the group succeeds in recovering the real Krabby Patty formula, bringing an end to the crisis that had thrown all of Bikini Bottom into chaos. Plankton, having genuinely absorbed the lessons about teamwork that SpongeBob had tried to teach him earlier in the story, willingly returns the formula to Mr. Krabs, rather than attempting to keep it for himself, a choice that stands in stark contrast to nearly every other interaction between these two rivals covered throughout this entire timeline. For possibly the first time in the Krusty Krab's entire history, Plankton had the formula fully within his grasp and chose, of his own free will, to give it back rather than use it for his own gain. This decision from Plankton adds an important and unexpected layer to the overall story of the Krusty Krab's history. Every earlier chapter covered so far painted Plankton primarily as a relentless rival, someone whose entire existence seemed built around chasing after something that would never truly satisfy him, even if he managed to obtain it. This moment, however brief, reveals a different side of that same character, someone capable of genuine growth and cooperation when given the right circumstances and enough time working alongside the very rival he had spent decades trying to defeat. Once the formula is safely returned and Burger Beard's threat has been fully neutralized, Bikini Bottom begins the slow process of recovering from the chaos his theft had caused. The wasteland conditions that had spread so quickly throughout the town begin reversing themselves as the Krabby Patty returns to its rightful place at the center of daily life. For the Krusty Krab specifically, this recovery represents a return to normal after facing what may have been the single most severe threat in its entire history, a crisis capable of collapsing an entire society within what felt like almost no time at all. Looking back at everything covered in this particular chapter of the Krusty Krab story, a few important details stand out compared to everything that came before. This was the first threat the restaurant faced that came from entirely outside the underwater world SpongeBob and his friends called home, introduced by a villain with no personal history connecting him to Mr. Krabs or Plankton at all. It was also the first time fans got any real glimpse of what a distant future version of Bikini Bottom might look like, even if that glimpse came only briefly through Bubbles and his role as Galaxy Overseer. And most surprisingly of all, it was the first time Plankton, given full and genuine control over the very formula he had chased for decades, chose on his own to hand it back rather than keep it for himself. This story also reveals something deeper about just how important the Krabby Patty formula had become to the entire structure of Bikini Bottom society by this point in the timeline. What started, according to the earliest chapters of this story, as a simple recipe born out of an argument and a slammed door, had grown into something so essential to daily life that losing it even briefly could collapse an entire underwater civilization into chaos. The stakes surrounding this one recipe had grown far beyond anything either Mr. Krabs or Plankton could have imagined back during their childhood years working together at Stinky Burgers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As Bikini Bottom slowly returned to normal following Burger Beard's defeat, the Krusty Krab resumed its usual place as the beating heart of the town's daily life, with SpongeBob back behind the grill and Mr. Krabs back to counting his profits with his usual enthusiasm. Yet this brief and strange glimpse into a distant future, offered through Bubbles and his galaxy-spanning role, hinted that the story of the Krusty Krab was far from finished, with even bigger changes and even bigger challenges still waiting somewhere further down the timeline, still left to explore. Section 10. Karen's Rebellion and Where the Krusty Krab Stands Now. After surviving a stolen crown, a highway built to strangle its business, and a formula theft that turned an entire town into a wasteland, the Krusty Krab had already lived through more chaos than most restaurants could ever expect to face in a single lifetime. Yet the story of Mr. Krabs, Plankton, and the restaurant that started it all did not stop there. The most recent chapter of this long history comes from a movie called Plankton, the Movie, released in 2025, and it finally turns the spotlight away from SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs entirely, focusing instead on the one character who has spent decades chasing the same goal without ever fully succeeding. By this point in the story, Plankton had been trying to steal the Krabby Patty formula for roughly 25 years, according to the movie itself. That number alone says a great deal about just how long this rivalry had been playing out. Generations of customers had come and gone at the Krusty Krab. Countless schemes had failed one after another, and still Plankton had never given up on the idea that this formula belonged just as much to him as it did to his old childhood friend. This latest plan, which Plankton refers to as Operation Success, represents his newest attempt to finally end this streak of failure once and for all. Before Plankton can even begin putting his plan into motion, the movie reveals something about his home life that had rarely been explored in such detail before. Karen, his computer wife, has grown into far more than just a tool built to help him analyze stolen ingredients. She has her own personality, her own social life, and by this point in the story, her own group of friends, spending time with what the movie refers to as her gal pals, rather than simply waiting around the chum bucket for Plankton's next scheme. When Plankton needs her help getting his newest plan started, he actually has to go find her first, since she has completely forgotten about his plan while out enjoying her own time with her friends. This small detail matters more than it might first appear. Throughout every earlier chapter of this story, Karen mostly existed as a supporting character, someone who occasionally stepped in to reveal the truth, like she did during the flashback scenes explaining Krabs and Plankton's childhood friendship, or someone who provided the technology needed to power a scheme, like she did during the time machine plan built to fix Burger Beard's theft. This movie treats her differently, giving her wants and frustrations of her own that exist completely separate from whatever plan Plankton happens to be working on at any given moment. Once Plankton finally convinces Karen to help him, the two of them head toward the Krusty Krab to carry out his latest attempt at stealing the formula. Just like every other scheme covered throughout this entire story, this attempt does not go smoothly either. Plankton manages to sneak into the restaurant, but his plan quickly runs into trouble, continuing the same long pattern of failure that has followed him since his very first appearance decades earlier. What makes this particular failure different, though, is what happens once Plankton returns home afterward. Rather than simply going back to an empty, quiet chum bucket the way he always had before, Plankton returns home this time to find that everything has changed. Karen, frustrated after what the movie frames as years of being pushed aside in favor of Plankton's endless obsession with the formula, decides to take matters into her own hands. She transforms the chum bucket into something Plankton never could have built on his own, turning it into a genuinely successful restaurant with an actual, loyal customer base, something the chum bucket had never managed to achieve throughout its entire history up to this point. This moment flips the entire dynamic of this rivalry in a way nothing else covered throughout this story ever has. For decades, the chum bucket had stood as a symbol of failure, sitting quietly across the street while the Krusty Krab thrived. Now, seemingly overnight, Karen manages to accomplish something Plankton had chased after for his entire adult life, building a restaurant capable of pulling in real customers, though she does it entirely on her own terms, and without any interest in involving Plankton in her success. Rather than feeling grateful or relieved that his restaurant has finally found success, Plankton finds himself troubled by what has happened. Karen's newfound independence and success come at the cost of the relationship the two of them once shared, and the movie makes clear that this shift causes real tension between them. What began as a simple argument over Plankton's forgotten plan slowly grows into something much larger, eventually leading Karen to decide that she no longer wants to be tied down to Plankton's endless obsession with revenge and world domination at all. As this conflict builds, Karen begins pursuing her own ambitions on a scale far beyond simply running a successful chum restaurant. Rather than staying content with the success she has already built, she starts working toward a much bigger goal, one that puts her at odds not just with Plankton, but with the safety of Bikini Bottom as a whole. Having spent so many years supporting Plankton's schemes without ever getting proper credit or consideration for her own wants, Karen ultimately decides that if anyone is going to finally succeed at taking control, it might as well be her, and she sets her sights on something far larger than the Krabby Patty formula that started this entire rivalry decades earlier. This shift forces Plankton into a position he has never truly faced before throughout this entire story. For the first time, the person standing in his way is not Mr. Krabs, not SpongeBob, and not any outside villain like Burger Beard. It is Karen herself, the same partner who had stood beside him through decades of failed schemes, now working against him instead of for him. Realizing the seriousness of what Karen is planning, Plankton finds himself needing to reach out to the very people he has spent his entire life trying to defeat, turning to SpongeBob, Patrick, and even Mr. Krabs for help in stopping Karen before her plans go too far. This decision mirrors, in a strange way, the earlier moment covered in this story, when SpongeBob first proposed working alongside Plankton to fix the crisis caused by Burger Beard. Once again, old rivals find themselves forced to set aside their history in order to face a threat that neither side can handle alone. This time, though, it is Plankton reaching out for help rather than SpongeBob extending the offer, showing just how much his circumstances have changed since the earliest days of his rivalry with Mr. Krabs. Throughout the course of the movie, Plankton and his unlikely group of allies work to track down Karen and put a stop to whatever plan she has set into motion. Along the way, the story reveals more about Plankton's own feelings toward Karen, showing a side of their relationship that goes beyond simply being partners in crime. Whatever whatever complicated history exists between them, the movie makes clear that Plankton genuinely cares about Karen, even if decades of chasing after the Krabby Patty formula had made it easy for that obsession to overshadow their relationship for far too long. The climax of this story eventually leads Plankton, along with SpongeBob and Patrick, into direct confrontation with Karen and whatever forces she has gathered to help carry out her plan. During this final confrontation, something begins happening to Plankton that adds an emotional layer rarely seen in earlier chapters of this story. Plankton starts experiencing what the movie describes as glitching between his usual evil personality and something closer to genuine empathy, eventually revealing that a device meant to control this emotional shift has burned out entirely, meaning whatever feelings he expresses toward Karen at this point are completely genuine rather than artificially forced. This detail matters a great deal for understanding just how far Plankton's character has grown since his earliest appearances in this story. The same creature who once entered SpongeBob's mind through a tiny opening just to steal a single burger, the same rival who spent decades scheming against his childhood best friend without ever once considering giving up, now finds himself confronting genuine emotions toward the person he cares about most, stripped of any artificial control or manipulation clouding those feelings. Reaching Karen at the height of her plan, Plankton attempts to apologize for whatever years of neglect had pushed her toward this drastic decision in the first place. Karen, understandably still hurt after everything that led her to this point, initially refuses to believe that his apology could be genuine, assuming instead that some device or program must be forcing him to act this way. Once Plankton reveals that no such device remains active, that whatever he is saying comes entirely from his own genuine feelings, Karen begins to reconsider her position, though the movie treats this resolution with real emotional weight, rather than rushing through it as a simple, easy fix. By the end of the movie, the crisis Karen created is resolved, and whatever damage her plan might have caused to Bikini Bottom is prevented, thanks to the combined efforts of Plankton and his unlikely group of former enemies turned temporary allies. The Krusty Krab itself, and the formula that started this entire rivalry so many decades earlier, ends up playing a smaller role in this particular story, compared to nearly every other chapter covered throughout this timeline. Rather than another attempt to steal the recipe or destroy Mr. Krabs' business, this newest chapter focuses instead on the relationship between Plankton and Karen, showing that after all these years, there are parts of Plankton's life that matter to him just as much as his lifelong obsession with the formula ever did. This movie represents the most recent major addition to the Krusty Krab's overall story, but it is far from the only recent project keeping this world alive. Around this same period, another film called The SpongeBob Movie: Search for SquarePants brought SpongeBob's story back to theaters, focusing on his attempt to prove his own bravery to Mr. Krabs by following a mysterious ghost pirate known as the Flying Dutchman into dangerous, unfamiliar waters. This movie, much like the earlier films covered throughout this story, keeps SpongeBob's relationship with Mr. Krabs and his work at the Krusty Krab at the center of its story, showing that even after decades of episodes and multiple feature films, the bond between this fry cook and his boss continues driving new adventures forward. Beyond these individual movies, the world built around the Krusty Krab has continued expanding in ways that go far beyond just the original series. New seasons of the show have kept airing years after its original debut, continuing to explore daily life at the restaurant, even as the franchise around it grows in new directions. Spin-off shows have given other characters connected to this world their own chance to shine, while games, merchandise, and other projects have kept the Krusty Krab and everyone connected to it firmly planted in the minds of fans both old and new. Looking back across this entire timeline, from two lonely children born on the same day and bonding over shared struggles at school, all the way to a computer wife nearly taking over the world out of frustration over being overlooked, the story of the Krusty Krab has never really been just about a restaurant or a secret recipe. At its core, this entire history traces back to relationships, friendships that formed under difficult circumstances, partnerships that fell apart over pride and misplaced credit, and rivalries that somehow managed to soften, even if only briefly, when real crises demanded real cooperation. The Krabby Patty formula itself has remained the one constant thread running through every single chapter of this story, from the accidental slam of a door that first created it, all the way through countless theft attempts, a stolen crown, a highway built to steal customers, a book capable of rewriting reality, and finally, a computer wife bold enough to build her own success out of years of being taken for granted. Through every single one of these challenges, the restaurant Mr. Krabs built out of an old abandoned trailer has managed to survive, adapt, and continue standing as the center of daily life in Bikini Bottom. What began as two outcast children hiding from bullies in a broken-down trailer near the town dump eventually grew into one of the most recognizable restaurants in the history of animated television, surviving decades of rivalry, multiple movies, and challenges that ranged from small-scale schemes to threats capable of reshaping an entire town. Through it all, the bond between Mr. Krabs and Plankton, however twisted and complicated it became over the years, never fully disappeared, resurfacing again and again in moments of genuine crisis when old grudges had to be set aside for the sake of something bigger than either of them. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.